No one would have thought that humanity would be on the brink of extinction 5,000 years ago when the years of despair reigned on Earth. At that moment, the only salvation for the rapidly collapsing world were four heroes who bravely stood up to protect people against Erebos, whom everyone knew as the spawn of evil. Among the heroes was the elven archmage and astrologer Luna, who did not seem to inspire fear, but behind her sweet appearance hid a powerful force. The team could not do without a master blacksmith from the dwarven race named Divino, whose hands were not only strong but also magical. The strong shoulder of the heroes was the great warrior from the race of beastmen, Aaron the Brave, and courage was all he had to take. The four saviors were closed by the dragon ruler Lucinus the Wise, thanks to whom it was possible to find a way out of any difficult situation. So all the heroes met the darkest times side by side 5,000 years ago and fought to the last for the sake of the future. On that fateful day, it seemed that even the sky was filled with the blood of those who fell on the battlefield, and the hope for survival faded with every second. The only survivor at that time was a young man who stood in front of a huge gaping hole in the dragon's flesh and tried to heal such a large wound. Lucinus the Wise turned to Kyle, but he immediately asked her to stop talking so as not to waste energy on it. But the dragon still asked to take his heart and finish what she started. The guy responded rudely by shouting at Lucinus to shut up, but all only because he wanted to save her, although he himself already understood that he would most likely lose her. The ruler confirmed the young man's bitter suspicions and said that her time was already over, but at the same time she remained just as wise and reserved. Just as Kyle was once again menacingly telling the dragon to be quiet because he couldn't concentrate on healing, the sound of tearing flesh was heard, and the guy looked in horror where the sound was coming from. Lucinus extended her heart to the young man and asked if he remembered their first meeting, and without waiting for an answer, assured the guy that they were still able to save this world. Kyle was angry from the pain that was tearing him apart from the inside, so he gritted his teeth and called the ruler a stupid lizard. But Lucinus, with her last breath, asked the young man for forgiveness for leaving everything to him and closed her eyes, stopping breathing. The boy reached out his hand to the most precious thing he had left from all his friends in the form of a crystal dragon heart. As his heart gradually evaporated, Kyle named all the heroes with whom he had fought against evil shoulder to shoulder, as if saluting them. When the young man was left with only a stone with the incredible power of the ruler, he thanked all the heroes for being by his side. Kyle absorbed into his body the powers that were in the dragon's heartstone in order to fulfill the last will of both the ruler and the other heroes. A column of released power rose into the sky, which was incompatible with human life, but Kyle was able to accept this energy within himself. The guy remained in place, waiting for the evil that he needed to remove from the face of the earth at any cost, because then everyone who died on the battlefield would have given their lives in vain. The one whose death he wanted most appeared before the hero, and Kyle didn't care even if his body burned to the ground. The warrior was ready at any cost to stop the darkness and death that this terrible spawn of hell brought, and which was not satisfied with what it had already done. Gritting his teeth, Kyle took out his sword, preparing to destroy evil in the name of his friends who, unfortunately, would no longer see it. The young man and his weapon were imbued with the dragon's powers, just as Lucinus wanted, and now all that was left was to do was strike the very soul of the fiend. The hero of the source, Kyle, moved towards the enemy and, gathering all his strength, prepared to kill Erebos and avenge the death of his friends. The guy didn't doubt for a moment that he couldn't handle it, but simply, without a drop of fear, flew towards the eyes burning with a red flame to behead the bastard. The expulsion of Erebos from the world became clear when the echo of the big explosion rolled across the sky, and all thanks to the sacrifice of the great queen Lucinus. And on this note, the story from the book ended. A man's voice was heard from the side, asking Raina to stop reading the already hackneyed story for a while, but the woman insisted that this was Leo's favorite book and asked to look at the reaction. Raina turned to her baby, saying that she would read him Heroes at the Source again, and began reading the huge book from the very beginning. But even by his appearance, the baby showed that he was not delighted. The child started to act up, but his mother took it as him liking the story. But in his head, the son asked her to stop reading him this crap, because there was no hint of joy on his face. Mom tried to start the story again about the great victory that took place 5,000 years ago, but Kyle was outraged that it was actually he who defeated Erebos. At that moment, the guy didn't understand why he was the only one who wasn't mentioned even once in that damn book. Time passed quickly, and the former hero was already studying at Dylan's school, where a class was just taking place in one of the classrooms. The teacher stood in front of the class and explained to the students that, as they knew, the most exciting era of heroes was currently taking place, and they were lucky to witness it live. The teacher also reminded the students that the hero protocol has existed in their world for 5,000 years, which meant that preparing for it was important for a future hero. As a seasoned person who already has some experience behind him, the teacher said that for as long as he can remember, life has changed dramatically. To the changes in life, the teacher solemnly added that now Delana School had been chosen as the venue for the entrance exams to Lumen Academy. The teacher was captivated by the spirit of adventure, and, under the influence of emotions, he told the students that he had no doubt that among them there could be heroes who would pass the exam and someday get into the protocol. Just as the mentor wanted to explain what needed to be done to pass the exam and get into the protocol, he was interrupted by the loud snoring of a student at the last desk. The guy reacted only when he was called by name, and the teacher was already in a bad mood and asked if the young man really knew the lecture so well that they were tiring him. There was no answer from the young man, so the teacher asked him to stand up and asked what ritual had to be done 5,000 years ago to become a hero. Leo Flo, who was already 15 at the time, had no answer, except that to become famous it was enough to do something outstanding, and then people would bow down before the hero. The teacher grabbed his head from such a delirious answer, and exhaling heavily, asked the class if anyone else had any thoughts on the question, and then one of the students' hand went up. The guy sitting next to Leo remarked that in ancient times, there was no way to earn the recognition of the gods. To make it more clear, the student explained that heroes were previously selected through a sacred ritual, of which there were several. As an example of one of these initiation rituals, the schoolboy cited the most common blood ritual, and Leo was already sitting nearby and listening to it. The teacher was pleased with the answer of his favorite from the class, but Leo was not impressed even for a moment, as the mentor and simply continued to rest at his desk, stretching sweetly. The teacher immediately praised Gullivan Dratton, from whom such good knowledge in the field of protocol and everything connected with it was fully expected. And in addition to everything, the guy was a magical genius. Gullivan answered the teacher's question not only to suck up to him, but also to wipe Leo's nose, so immediately after the teacher's words about placing great hopes on the genius in the upcoming exam, he turned to the young man with the look of a winner. But Leo didn't care about the upstart, because while leafing through the book he remembered from his past life the great hero Kyle, that meeting with the gods was a trifle, and that holy rituals also belonged to that. Remembering his team, the young man identified the hero protocol as a miracle sent by the gods to the lower world to celebrate the victory of the great heroes over Erebos. Having experienced an incredible adventure side by side with the heroes, Leo now looked at his studies as mortal boredom and therefore slammed the book shut. The young man stared out the window wondering only one question: why was he the only one who had been passed over for such honors? The silence in the classroom was broken by the students themselves, who stuck to the glass windows and shouted with delight that the guests with the emblem of the Zerdinger family were already at the school. The school children couldn't believe that they could now see Celia Zerdinger herself walking down the corridor of their school. Leo rose from his desk just as the announcement was made for the students to gather in the assembly hall to celebrate the arrival of guests from the Zerdinger family to the school. Gullivan immediately reacted to his classmates' movements and asked if he was really going to do something weird just to attract the guests' attention, and he himself sarcastically clarified that it made no sense since they didn't care about him at all. Leo reacted exactly to the nonsense said by the upstart, saying that he was actually going to go home, which surprised him. Moving towards the exit, the guy clarified that, unlike Gullivan, he was not interested in all this pompous nonsense on the occasion of the arrival of people like them. And here the excellent student completely dropped out. Gullivan immediately began to justify himself by saying that he was also going home, and even if he had gone to the assembly hall, it would only have been to look at Celia as a future rival. But Leo could no longer be stopped, and he waved his hand sarcastically and nodded in agreement. Leo chose a more beneficial workout at home instead of meeting a girl about the same age as him. Having been practicing for some time, the guy took a break to cool down and began to think about whether there was a difference between his past skills and his current ones. Going outside, Leo realized that it was not surprising at all, considering the regular training. But this body was still much better than what he had in his past life. The young man managed to react in time to the question from the side about what he was thinking so meticulously, because at that very moment, without warning, a woman with a sword was flying at him. But the mother was unable to catch her son by surprise since not only did he have a fight with Erebos behind him, but his current training was also making itself felt. The guy noted that it was quite an idea to attack him so abruptly from an ambush, but the woman only playfully replied that they hadn't warmed up for a long time. Mother reminded Leo that meager talent was no good for Lumen, thus justifying her sharp attack. Raising her sword high above her head, the woman merely warned Leo that this was his final test before he wanted to enter the academy. When the swords clashed, sparks flew from them, and the ringing sound spread throughout the entire yard, and the vibration of iron was felt in the hands. The mother came close to her son's face so that he could clearly hear her question whether she should become even harder now for a better result. But the guy was able to fight off the woman's attack, and what helped him was that he remembered all this time who he was, and he was not going to give up. Leo, catching his breath, looked at his mother and snapped that her display of love for him was too rude, although in reality he didn't care. The lady was amused by the young man's statement, and she replied that although he was throwing around such statements, he was blocking every single blow. In Mother's opinion, the test was not yet complete, so now she really attacked the student with all her might. The most interesting thing was that the woman was afraid that she had struck too hard when it was already too late, and the blade of the sword was near the young man's face. As soon as the lady's thoughts began to doubt that Leo might not have time to block her blow, the guy was already dodging to the side. The young master watched the sword blade pass by his face with an even expression, and there was not a hint of fear or panic on him. Incredibly, the tip of the weapon appeared in a split second, not in the eyes of the young man, but in the eyes of the lady, and she clearly did not expect such a turn of events. As a result, the mother sat on the ground watching how her own son managed to dodge her strongest blow and, what's more, defeat her. The tip of the sword was still aimed at the woman's neck, but she was only thinking about how great the talent of the child standing in front of her was. When the lady stood up, catching her breath, she asked Leo if he still intended to enter the Lumen Academy given such results. For a moment, the image of the human Academy of Heroes Lumen froze in front of the boy, and he gave himself time to answer his mother. Leo reminded himself that it was in Lumen, as one of all the academies of the 4 races included in the protocol, that there was a high probability of finding records of his past incarnation. And when the young man returned to the answer, he immediately made it clear to his mother that he really still intended to get into the academy. The lady was pleased with this answer and told her son that members of the Zerdinger family would soon arrive and then stay at their estate. Leo asked if the guests really needed to stay with them, to which his mother answered yes. But at the same time, she clarified with understanding that she didn't really want that either, but it was necessary to ask Zeus for a favor to teach the young man the Zerdinger aura techniques. The lady jokingly ruffled her disgruntled son's hair and happily announced that with the help of Zeus and his training, Leo would have enough strength to enter the academy next year. Leo smiled only after he mentally told his mother that he intended to enroll this year and was filled with confidence. The guests arrived at the estate with their guards, and given that the territory was large, there was room for everyone. The carriage swayed and creaked as the most important visitors, one of whom was Celia, emerged from it. The young lady walked down the steps evenly and gradually, as befits a girl of high manners and the same status. Getting off the carriage, 15-year-old Princess Celia looked around and was already unhappy that her uncle had decided to stop here, although they had the opportunity to book the entire hotel. The girl's head was filled with the fact that she needed to concentrate on the entrance exams to the academy, and here was this seedy mansion of a small family. But her uncle's call distracted her from her thoughts. The deputy head of the Zerdinger clan, Zeus, asked the princess if she was curious about what Leo was like, and mentioned that this young man had declared his disinterest in their clan. Celia closed her eyes with disdain and waved her hand and replied that Leo was nothing more than a promising knight who had not yet mastered the aura, so she did not see anything outstanding in him, but the master laughed and said that it was not that simple. Once inside the mansion, the hosts and guests greeted each other, and Zeus bowed and said that it was an honor for him to meet the Flo family. Raina reciprocated Zeus's feelings, and Dade also stood next to his wife, showing with all his appearance that he was glad to see the guests. Zeus introduced Marquise Flo to Celia and asked the princess to introduce herself properly to the hosts of the house. The girl, taught the manners of communicating with people like herself, introduced herself with restraint and bowed slightly. The princess also expressed her gratitude to the owners for kindly agreeing to shelter them for a week. Raina came closer to Celia and said that she was glad to finally meet her, and the girl at that moment thought that this woman looked terribly like her father and uncle. The next moment, the princess was even more shocked by the fact that Mrs. Flo had red eyes and black hair, which was no longer just a coincidence. Celia stood and stared at Reina, who also froze in front of her, holding out her hand to shake, and neither of them were able to say anything. To dispel any doubts or guesses in such an awkward silence, Zeus intervened and informed Celia that Reina Flo was her real aunt. While the servants were delivering things to the guest quarters, a conversation had already begun between Zeus and Reina over a cup of tea, where the man shared his impressions of his visit to Delana's school, where there was complete chaos and the children were running around like crazy in all directions. Zeus also didn't forget to note that the only one who distinguished himself among all that school chaos was Leo, because he immediately got ready and went home, to which Reina replied that this was really a blow to the Zerdinger pride. Reina laughed sheepishly and asked for forgiveness if her son's behavior was disrespectful, since Leo really has little interest in anything other than his training. While the adults were sipping tea in the hall, the young people were already in full swing training outside. Zeus asked Reina what kind of child Leo was, and she, stirring sugar in her tea, told her brother that the boy was truly incredibly gifted. The brother wanted to find out here and now, from his older sister, whether she believed that Leo could have inherited the Zerdinger flame. The boys were training in the yard, and the mother, looking at her Leo, told her brother that she was talking about him not because he was her son, but because he truly deserved praise. Zeus liked his sister's answer, and he smiled and said that she was able to interest him in teaching the young man. But the man's expression changed, and he told Reina that before training began, he wanted to personally verify the guy's abilities, although Celia at that moment already felt the power of the one she despised. And Leo, as always, was confident in what he was doing, not forgetting that this was training and knew how to stop in time. The sharp test of the guy's strength in a sword fight did not happen out of nowhere. And if you look at the situation not through the eyes of their relatives, but from the perspective of the young people, then it all started with Leo sitting in the hall in complete concentration. The bracelet on the guy's hand was glowing, and this was a very important sign for him because then he finally felt that the vessel that could hold all his power was completed, and this was a new branch of his improvement. The young master knew very well that the reason he had not yet been able to master the aura was that as soon as he selected it, the power would encounter a natural discrepancy with his current body, so the ability to accumulate mana would disappear. Since Leo remembered himself as the hero Kyle, now he realized the bitter truth that if he could have completely controlled the power and energy of the team in his past life, then that disaster would not have happened. The young man set himself the goal of mastering complete control in this life. And as soon as he began to list the first point about the aura for himself, he heard footsteps behind him, and someone in a girl's voice addressed him with the question of whether he was Leo Flo. The young gentleman turned around to see who was standing in front of him, but even when he saw Celia herself in front of him, he didn't even jump up, but remained sitting on the floor. Celia immediately complimented Leo that his base seemed to be at a decent level, but then she said that she wanted to thoroughly improve his fencing, and she herself was already thinking about how she would earn her aunt's favor in this way. The guy, without a shadow of embarrassment, asked who was in front of him, to which the girl introduced herself as Celia Zerdinger. The young lady also immediately clarified that she is known to the public as the Sword Princess, thinking that she could impress the young man with this. Leo stood up and pretended to be surprised by such information, after which he thanked them for their concern and answered bluntly that he did not need lessons from someone whose skills were not inferior to his own. The princess didn't like this tone, and she immediately gave in to her emotions and cried out, "Is it really possible that with such words the guy wants to say that she is weak?" Leo in turn remained calm and once again directly stated that perhaps in a battle to the death, Celia would be stronger, but only because he could not yet use his aura. The young man smiled sweetly and emphasized that if we take only the moment of fencing, then that is a different matter, and yes, it really could be that Celia is weaker. No matter how thoroughly a student is trained in high-quality combat skills, when emotions take over, as is happening to the princess now, it is simply a show. In the blink of an eye, Celia found the place in the hall where the training weapons were kept, in order to prove to the upstart right here and now that she was not a weakling. Armed not only with a sword, but also with self-confidence, the girl headed towards Leo, saying that if he was so confident in his abilities, they would engage in sparring right now. Celia laughed inside at this unfortunate boy, mocking him for being sure that if he had mastered the aura, he was already the strongest. So she decided that she would be the one who would confront him with the harsh reality. The princess immediately outlined the terms of the deal, in which if she won, Leo would be his servant for the next week, to which he smiled and asked what would happen otherwise. Putting his sword forward, Celia still didn't like how confident this little bastard was, but a deal was a deal. The girl knew that she would win, so she easily agreed that if the guy won, she would be his personal servant for the whole week. Leo took his time and bent down to pick up his training weapon, perceiving this fight as an interesting game. When the sword was ready, the guy asked his rival what could be done in that case, and without waiting for an answer, he made a lightning-fast jump from the spot straight to Celia. The young master was not going to stand on ceremony since the girl had proven herself to be a princess of the sword, which meant she could fight with all her might. Sliding back, Celia tried not to show it, but she took into account that the guy's speed wasn't that bad, which was the first sign to change her mind. But pride took over, and the princess thought that good speed was not enough, so she ran towards Leo just as he did. The young man, without slowing down, swung his sword again, and when he hit Celia's weapon, she thought for the first time that in front of him was not a simple boy, but something stronger. Leo's blow was so strong that the wave sent Celia flying to the side, the floor shattering into pieces and sending boulders flying in all directions. Without giving her time to recover from the blow, the young man again flew at the princess with an attack, and now Celia looked with frightened eyes at this armored train, realizing that she would not be able to block such a blow. The poor thing was so terrified of what her opponent was capable of that she didn't even have time to put up her sword as a defense. But Leo couldn't do anything to the young lady because he collided with her aura shield and immediately clarified that such use goes beyond the scope of ordinary fencing. And Celia herself justified herself by saying that for her, it manifested itself as a normal reflex, and it made her very angry because she already understood that she was on the verge of defeat. Leo said clearly that what the princess said was not important because she would win anyway, and with this he caught her by surprise, and succumbing to panic, the girl shouted that with and without an aura, they were different things. In response to his rival's statement, Leo provocatively suggested testing something similar, and a click was heard on the bracelet. A piece of iron fell to the floor with a loud ringing sound, and Celia finally realized that these were magical weights. The young man caught the girl's reaction but was not going to stop, so he smiled and made another jump towards victory. With one clear blow, Leo shattered the aura shield, against which, in theory, a wooden sword should not have worked. Celia was horrified as a wooden sword shattered against the aura before her eyes, but her shield also crumbled into small pieces. The girl looked at her opponent, and in her head, there was only one question. Where did such a monster come from? And the last thing she thought about before passing out was that Leo was sick in the head. As it got dark, Zeus and Reyna were walking through the estate's gardens talking, not yet suspecting what awaited them. The lady was formed when she noticed her son, who was also walking, and immediately called him to introduce him to her brother. Leo obediently approached his mother, who introduced him to the very guest who had arrived in their domain for a week. The guy wanted to and was not dressed up like Celia, but he respected Zeus with a greeting and a bow, introducing himself as Leo Flo. Zeus also introduced himself and said that the young man probably already knew, but before further clarification, he still said that he was his uncle, and extended his hand in greeting. The men shook hands, and Zeus was the first to express his joy at their meeting, which he had been waiting for. Reyna didn't forget to ask her son if he had seen Celia yet, since they hadn't seen her anywhere yet. And just at that moment, the poor fellow was being carried out on burdens, so the guy found it difficult to answer, but in essence it was like confirmation that the young gentleman had met. While the unfortunate woman lay in a state of shock and muttered under her breath the name of the culprit of her condition, Reyna could not understand what had happened, but she ordered that the princess be taken to the infirmary. Zeus asked one of the guards what had happened, and he began to explain the situation, but this was clarification only on his part. While the soldier was explaining to his master what had happened, Zeus looked at the guy and thought only about whether he could really defeat Celia without an aura. Mr. Zerdinger personally approached Leo and emphasized that it was quite impressive that he was able to defeat the princess, to which he, as always, responded without embarrassment that the girl herself had underestimated him. Zeus immediately asked what the guys had bet on, and the guy happily said that the loser would serve the winner. The young man was glad that Celia would be his personal maid for the next week, and until that moment Zeus was also smiling. But in the blink of an eye, the gentleman's expression changed, and he agreed with Leo that it was really important to keep his word. But he reminded him that Celia was, after all, the heiress of the Zerdinger house. Zeus told the boy that a girl like Celia could not do housework. The gentleman extended his hand to the boy, expressing his hopes that he would reconsider their deal and wanted to offer another deal in return. But Leo didn't even let him finish. He interrupted and refused. which shocked Zeus, and for a moment he didn't even know what to say. At the same time, the young man rightly voiced that the princess herself proposed the bet, and herself proposed sparring, and in that case it would be fair if she were punished, if of course she values the name of her family. Zeus asked if the guy's opinion would change even if he was offered training in the Zerdinger breathing technique for controlling the aura. Leo's straightforwardness was not to be borrowed, so he said that he had no need for a breathing technique that would help him avoid humiliating his niece. Zeus looked closely at his offspring and asked if he had understood correctly that he was declaring that he was going to use the direct heir of the Zerdinger family as a servant and that their family technology was worth nothing. It is not known where Leo got so much self-confidence, but not even a muscle on his face twitched, and he made it clear that everything was exactly as the gentleman had just said. Zeus decided to ask if the guy was still draining his attitude by being rude, but even here Leo knew his limits, so he immediately clarified that he had no intention of insulting the Zerdingers. Putting his hand on his heart, the young man said that if Sir Zeus wanted to teach him the breathing technique as a reward for defeating Selene, he would gladly agree. But it turns out that he simply wants to cover up the princess's defeat. While there was a conversation between Zeus and Leo, the guards already learned that the young lady had woken up. Meanwhile, Leo continued to explain that in the case of covering up the defeat, everything is going to the fact that deep down Zeus thinks that if Celia had not lost her vigilance, she would not have lost. Reyna was proud of her son, not interfering in the conversation until he finished his explanation that even if the princess had taken the fight seriously, she would still have lost. Zeus smiled lightly, realizing that the young man had refused the offer because he did not like how they treated him, and this was confirmation that he really had an unusual child in front of him. The gentleman thought that if only Leo were a real Zerdinger, but he did not continue his own thought and called the guards to him. Zeus stunned the guards by ordering them to recall Celia's maids, but they could not object to their master's wishes. The man addressed the boy by name to establish eye contact, and Leo was still confidently ready to listen to Sir Zeus. The gentleman clarified that this was their unofficial meeting, so he put his hand on Leo's shoulder and asked him to call him simply Uncle, to which the guy happily agreed. Zeus watched his nephew go, and now all that was left was to talk to his sister, who had not said a word so far. The brother himself turned to his sister, asking whether she had asked him to teach her son breathing techniques, something that Reyna did not quite understand at first. Therefore, Zeus himself said that he would try to convince their older brother to let Leo learn the breath of the phoenix. The chambers were spacious and clean, and the sunlight made the room look even more cozy. The light tones of the room were contrasted by the redness of Celia's face, who furiously announced that she was a maid and would be serving for a whole week. The girl's teeth began to grind when she had to call her snotty opponent sir. Let's be honest, Leo allowed himself to have a little fun. So the first thing he did was compliment the girl on how well this outfit suited her. Celia was still angry but embarrassed when she heard the guy's comment about how her cheeky personality fit so well into such a simple suit, and began to look at her. The princess felt uneasy because of the awkwardness, so she said that she knew that everything suited her, but such compliments were too much, for which Leo immediately apologized and admitted that he did not do it to anger her. The guy was again flooded with memories, and this time about a friend who valued beauty too much, and it turns out that he infected him with it. And from this feeling, Leo sighed nostalgically, staring somewhere far away. In the young man's head, a voice sounded exactly like his friend's, as if he was standing in front of him and saying that the beauty of eternity is incomparable. And the guy's voice carried him to a clearing where Dveno sat surrounded by animals and said that if peace returned to their lands, he would devote the rest of his life to spreading beauty everywhere. It would seem like a wonderful desire of a wonderful person. But there was one problem, which was his excessive honesty, which collided with the incredible perfection of Lucinus and Luna, but at the same time both were aggressive. So at one point Dveno, leaning against the beautiful heroines, asked them in the name of art to do something for him. But when the big guy announced that he wanted the girls to pose for him naked and he would capture them on paper, the countdown to the grand mess had already begun. Aaron and Kyle stood to the side watching as Dveno got what he deserved from the girls, and realized that they definitely wouldn't interfere here. While Leo was daydreaming in his memories, Celia noticed the young man had a book and thought it was for training, so she immediately asked what the gentleman was reading. The guy picked up the book and smiling affectionately said that he often read this story in his childhood, or rather his mother started doing it. When the princess heard the title, Great Heroes at the Source, She was also taken back to memories of when she was about 5 years old and was a little outraged by why she was reading a history book. Celia already had some kind of plan of her own, but she couldn't find anything to cling to, and this irritated her. The girl confidently walked towards the shelves with books without saying a word to Leo, but he himself had already noticed the maid's movements. Approaching the shelves and looking at the books for some time, Celia said that judging by everything, the gentleman especially liked the books he had already mentioned. The princess also decided to compliment the guy and emphasized that the average researcher of great heroes cannot compare with him, but he simply replied that he started collecting and it turned out that way. At some point, Celia reached out to one of the books, noticing something interesting and wanting to ask the guy about it directly. Pulling the book towards herself, the girl clarified that among the entire collection, the most copies were about Kyle. Celia leafed through the book she had chosen, while Leo explained that among all the deeds of great heroes, there are some that are difficult to attribute to any one of them. The guy expressed his opinion that the achievements that are being talked about now belong to Kyle as a great hero because Leo, like no one else, knew what he did for humanity in his past life. But Celia slammed the book shut and indignantly snorted that this Kyle was simply a liar because he had curried favor with other people's achievements. Leo was not surprised by this version of the story because he had long since come to terms with people's attitudes toward what had once happened. So he reacted evenly to the girl's statement. The princess put the book back in place and said that she had just voiced the opinion of the majority of people about Kyle, and she also agreed with them, and the guy once again concluded that this is how people remembered him, and Celia heard this quiet voice. To distract his maid from some strange thoughts, he said that it was time to have breakfast and go to training. Here the princess played along and turned to her master and asked for permission to train with him, while hiding behind this, her desire to learn the secret of his strength. Leaving, Leo asked if the princess would cry if she didn't keep up with him, which again caused irritation and a statement that Celia Zerdinger was still in front of him. And so the poor guy sits on the floor of the training room and rubs his back, which he just got hit on by the upstart Leo. The guy in turn did not mock, but explained that when a girl gets tired, her reaction slows down a lot, and this causes gaps, namely like the open back right now. Out of breath, Celia asked if torturing the body like that really helps in training, because it is exhaustive. But Leo replied that torturing the case or going beyond one's limits really helps, and he also clarified that in his opinion, young people now feel too sorry for themselves. The young man could compare the past with what was happening now, and the conclusion was that due to the advancement of aura techniques, people stopped paying attention to body training, and Celia was now proof of that. Leo stood calmly analyzing further that the aura allows to strengthen the body, but if it is also additionally trained, then the effectiveness of the aura increases. The poor thing was shaking all over when she got to her feet and somehow pointed her sword at her opponent, trying to gather not only her strength, but also her thoughts. The girl felt offended by the way the guy who had not had to go through what she had gone through was behaving, so again, in a fit of emotion, she shouted at him not to underestimate her. And when Celia called the guy a blonde puppy, she rushed towards him, repeating her mistake again. Leo didn't even move from his place, but just hit the fury that was rushing at him without any idea what she was doing, so Celia rolled back. The princess fell to the floor with a crash and the weapon along with her, but that was the end of the attack, in the face, which Leo knew when to stop. The girl started sobbing and screaming why she couldn't win, to which the guy calmly approached and asked if it was hard for her. When Leo saw in Celia's eyes an affirmative answer that it was really hard for her, he handed her the bracelet, for which she thanked him. But as soon as the small trinket was in the princess's hands, it fell with her to the floor, as if magnetized. And Leo reminded her that it was, after all, a magical weight. The guy again allowed himself to gloat a little and told the girl that she would wear the bracelet from that day on during all training sessions because he knew that she was stubborn and would not refuse to become better, and he only found it funny to watch it. Training took place not only in closed rooms or small courtyards, but also in huge areas set aside specifically for such activities. Zeus was watching the boys, and for now Celia was only showing how tired she was, so she directly stated that she had had enough and fell to the ground. The gentleman thought that for the princess such training would really be a valuable experience, especially before entering Lumen, and such classes would help to pinch her pride a little. Zeus realized that there was no point in contacting the girl now, since she was tired and would be angry, so he called Leo for a conversation. The guy ran to the edge of the platform and greeted his uncle, already knowing that the conversation would clearly not be about the weather. The young man's thoughts were confirmed when he heard the master state that he was thinking of asking the chief to pass on the phoenix breath technique to Leo. Since the young man was rather reserved in terms of showing emotions, even now he did not really show them, but at the same time, slight surprise and interest flashed across his face. Leo was surprised because he knew that only recognized members of the Zerdinger family could learn the technique. Celia intervened in the conversation, not intending to let this go so easily, and clarified that her father would not give his consent just like that. Zeus did not particularly react to the young lady's statement, but at the same time confirmed her words by continuing the conversation with the guy, and clarified that there was one condition for learning the technique, and Celia was already amazed by this. Uncle told Leo about successfully passing the entrance exams to Lumen, and the princess began to object that we were talking about a real fight. The princess did not want to allow this to happen because she felt intense competition from Leo, and at the same time calling him a runt. She told her uncle that he could not even use his aura, so it was dangerous for him. Leo smiled sarcastically at the girl's statement, thinking that it was good that she didn't know his whole story. And remembering his past, Flo sarcastically replied that he really has no experience in a real fight behind him, and added to himself that in this life it is definitely the same. Zeus, enduring the princess's whims, was still waiting for an answer from the guy himself, but he decided to first clarify the will of his father and mother. And when the uncle said that if we assume that the parents are not against it, the young man immediately and happily agreed to such a condition. Zeus noted for himself that the boy was still planning to take the exam on his own, even without his parents' knowledge. When the conversation was over, Leo reminded the girl that the break was already over and asked if she would continue, to which she ran after him, more out of anger, and asked if he really thought she wouldn't be able to keep up with him. A week later, the students gathered on the day of the entrance exams to Lumen Academy, and the one who stood out the most from the crowd was, of course, Celia in her white robe. The students immediately began to whisper about the fact that Mrs. Zerdinger herself was among them, but they were also interested in who was next to her. But the girl was impatient to find out if the young gentleman was nervous, to which he answered negatively. The next moment, Leo asked how long the girl would call him master, as if she were still a maid, which is why she could only gasp. The guys were distracted from their conversation by someone's voice calling specifically for Celia, and she immediately turned around at the call. Gullivan came closer and was shocked to see that the scoundrel Leo Flo was standing next to Princess Zerdinger herself. The upstart changed his tune in the blink of an eye, first humiliating Leo by saying that he was incompetent, and that without the possession of an aura, he had nothing to do here. And then he turned with a smarmy smile to Celia, duplicitously asking how things were going. Imagine the nerd's surprise when both the princess and the stupid classmate ignored him and looked at him with disdain. In order to somehow save his position, Gullivan introduced himself and reminded Celia that they met when she attended school. The young man's attempt to tell about how he was considered a gift in Delan failed because Celia asked for forgiveness and immediately said that she did not remember him. The girl, without thinking twice, grabbed Leo's hand, which gave rise to absolutely everyone's rumors and gossip, but she didn't care. Having told Gullivan at the end that the conversation was over, the princess rushed away with Leo away from this upstart. She couldn't run far because someone called Celia again, and this time the voice was familiar to her. And when she turned around, she realized that she definitely couldn't avoid this meeting. If the princess's face was frozen in bewilderment at the sight of those who called her, then on Leo's face there was only the question of who they were. In front of the students were 16-year-old Abbott Revelin and 14-year-old Chelsea Revelin, who reminded Lady Zerdinger that they had not seen each other for a long time. Since Celia didn't go to the guys, they took on this mission and went to the princess to exchange a few words before the exams. The girl's hands reflexively clenched into fists, as she was clearly not prepared for a warm welcome, and Leo, noticing her tension, asked who they were, to which she briefly turned away the Revelin brother and sister. Celia made a face that even Leo didn't greet with and added that these smart guys were from the League of Heroes of the Lordan Empire. The young lady was determined and told the guy that if these thugs stood in their way, they should never lose to them because the Zerdingers do not surrender to some Revelin, to which the young man reminded that he is actually from the Flo clan. When Revelin's brother and sister came up and hypocritically said that they were glad to see Celia, she played along with them, but after that they wanted to know who was standing next to her. The princess introduced Leo from the Flo family and clarified that this was a famous aristocratic family in the Delan kingdom. After Abbott's comment that it was clear to him that he was dealing with a small fry, his gaze met Leo's. Turning around to leave, Abbott only added to Celia that the first place would be his and ordered his sister to follow him. The princess called the brother and sister arrogant idiots and expressed her desire to crush them with her own hands. But dreams of kicking ass had to be put aside because the examiner's voice was heard from above, concluding that it seemed like everyone who wanted to had already gathered. Everyone immediately turned their attention to the voice of the person who was important to them today, and Leo and Celia were no exception. R.V. Jerome, a professor at the Lumen Academy, appeared before the students and briefly introduced himself by stating only his first name without unnecessary affectation. Celia again gave an ambiguous reaction to the examiner, and although she said that it could not be that the sorcerer Mon was in front of them, Leo still asked who it was. The guy's lack of recognition will eventually finish off the princess, but even though she was angry at him for not knowing, she still told him that he was a hero who was included in the hero protocol. Leo caught the important moment that in front of him was one of the recognized heroes of today's era, and raising his head, carefully examined him. The first thing that caught the guy's attention was the mana coming from Arvy's left eye, which was also important to remember. Arvy read from a piece of paper that the students would have to undergo a test in the form of a one-on-one fight, and then a fight with a monster, and the performance would take place in turns. Literally immediately after reading, the examiner squeezed several sheets of paper and burned them to the ground. And when the ashes cleared, Arvy told his students that he considered such methods too outdated and boring. The sorcerer, without thinking twice, took a book out from under his clothes to slightly change the rules for passing the exam. When the book opened, the same heroic protocol opened with it, and Arvy's world loaded, the pages of which the hero flipped through with his finger in the air. The examiner's choice fell on chapter prologue. Wild forest and half the hall disappeared under the students' feet, and something like a portal appeared. Arvy placed his hand over the protocol in order to transfer the students to the place he considered necessary for taking the entrance exam. The sorcerer decided to make it clear to everyone that he couldn't stand ineffective teaching methods, and Celia was shocked by this. Arvy continued to say that he was now just combining individual tasks into one test, and at that moment he met the gaze of the recruit who was also looking at the examiner. Leo immediately remembered the lessons and the lecturer's words about the heroic protocol being more than just a historical guide. The true value of writing was the ability to create a separate world of heroes in which the experience of heroes of the past would immediately be present. But the most important thing in this world was not that you would fight and gain your own experience and create your own history. The most important thing in the protocol was that by getting into it, one could inherit the power of the heroes of the past. Now Leo understood that the protocol was a kind of training system for heroes with a lot of possibilities. While the guy was thinking about his own, Arvy had already moved the test participants to where he considered it necessary. The students found themselves in the wild forest, and while they were looking around, Arvy introduced them to the place and the goal, which was simply to survive. The examiner also clarified that it doesn't matter whether the students unite or kill each other, and reminded them once again that the main thing is to survive, and those who want to leave need to break the sphere in their hand. And while the students were already in a panic, Leo only noted that the place hadn't changed at all. Having taken a step towards his test, the guy was doubly interested in what awaited him this time, because life was already different. But in the memories, the wild forest will forever remain the habitat of the elves until the moment when Salanta, the witch queen, poisoned it. From all sides, the students were surrounded by different sounds that related both to nature and to something more terrible and dangerous. Somewhere from behind the bushes, one of the students could already be heard screaming that he wanted to go home and didn't care about this exam. The friend tried to cheer up the poor guy by shouting at him that it was just an illusion and called him a whiner, thinking that this would help. But Leo kept silent about the fact that this world was an illusion because he knew that although the place was created from Arvy's memories, everything that happened here had now become real again. Just as the young man was thinking that everything that threatens life here can actually kill, something that does not concern this world rushed past. Leo managed to jump back from the arrow in time, and as it landed, cracks appeared on the ground, indicating the enemy's strength. The young man immediately spotted the place where the arrow was launched from, but he still didn't understand who it was, since the person was standing in the shadows. The one who didn't show it when they met came out into the world, but now she could live it up in grand style. Chelsea, with malicious goodwill, informed Leo that she would be only too happy to get rid of the Zerdinger henchman. The guy looked at the clearly unbalanced girl and briefly and calmly replied that he belonged to the Flo family. Activating her power, Chelsea fiercely asked why the offspring was stuck to Celia and why he needed this. But there was no response from the young man, so the girl, lacking patience, said, "Sickle of the wind," and drew the blade through the air. Leo was only silently surprised that in his previous incarnation there was no such spell, but as always, nothing moved on his face. The guy prepared his sword, realizing that no matter how sophisticated these new techniques were, the basic principles remained unchanged. Chelsea stood there for now, looking for any kind of reaction from her opponent, but seeing nothing, she let out a sarcastic laugh. The girl thought that if she told the guy that she was actually his opponent and he didn't even bother, then this would change something, but the miracle didn't happen. Chelsea made another attempt to instill fear in their opponents with their sickle tricks, hoping that at least this way it would be more fun. But Leo remained in place and waited silently, and when this enraged the girl, she threw her weapon at him. Feeling support, the guy with one blow of his worthless sword repelled the incredible sickle of the stupid girl. The sickle ended up behind and stuck in the ground, and Leo continued to maintain a calm and level posture, once again expecting another outburst. Chelsea decided not to panic for now either, but was mildly surprised that the little bastard blocked her blow, even though she didn't even feel his aura, and this led her to think that the guy had an aura of an elusive attribute. Leo smiled and called the girl's attack quite obvious, after which he suggested combining their efforts and reminded them that whoever holds out longer will score more points. But in response, the young man heard again only a contemptuous laugh with which Chelsea showed the supposed stupidity of the participant. The student, feeling sorry for her opponent, told him that, to his deep regret, she was a battle mage, showing by this that she was superior. A staff appeared in Chelsea's hands, and she asked again if she had misheard the bastard saying that her attack was simple. Leo decided to play dumb, and asked if he had really said that out loud, and immediately corrected himself by stating that he meant that for wind magic, it was a straightforward attack compared to its true capabilities. The pride of the outstanding student was also hurt by some ragamuffin, so she indignantly said, "Is he really going to lecture her now on how to use her ancestral power as a direct heir?" Chelsea suggested kicking the little brat's ass with those same simple attacks and shouted wind sickle and wind arrow. The girl was taken aback when she saw that her attacks had gone nowhere since the guy had already disappeared from that place. Fear crept up unnoticed, and the most terrible thing was that the student did not feel even a hint of the enemy's mana. As soon as the princess asked why this was so if he was a simple guy, this small fry suddenly appeared in front of her as if from under the ground. Chelsea only had time to scream from the unexpected turn of events and the way an ordinary and nondescript young man was able to catch her off guard. The girl's scream caused the birds to fly up, and along with them, the sickle flew into the air like a boomerang. Coughing, Chelsea fell to her knees in front of Leo and no longer threatened him with anything since her life was in danger. Putting up his fist again, the young man politely offered Chelsea one last time to join forces. And while a real mess was going on among the students in the forest, the rest watched them sitting in the hall. When Chelsea woke up, she couldn't move because she was tightly tied to a pole and at first didn't understand what was happening. Looking down, the girl saw Leo, who had already managed to light a fire and was sitting in anticipation, holding the rope with which he had tied up the self-confident student. The guy looked like this because if you saw him from the side, you would think that he was planning something truly terrible. The small fire gradually flared up, and Leo's plan no longer looked like some kind of joke that would scare Chelsea and make her change her mind. When the girl came to after passing out and felt the heat of the flame, she screamed, and the only thing she could say was what the hell was going on. Leo, sitting in front of the girl, asked the only question, would she cooperate with him or not? Which is why Chelsea was shocked that for this reason the crazy guy went to such cruel measures. Even though the fire was getting stronger, the girl stubbornly refused to cooperate and was sure that she could get out of it now. Chelsea shouted to the brat that she didn't need anyone except her brother and set her attack wind sickle, but instead of activating the power, red rings appeared on her hands. Seeing Chelsea's reaction, the guy immediately explained to her that she was currently under a spell that limited the use of magic, and she felt that her Manka was really low, and this meant that she would not last long. Having told Leo that she could get out without magic, the brave girl began to try to move her body, but it was difficult for her. The young man pulled the rope towards himself and, smiling maliciously, asked the girl if she really thought he would let her get out just like that. The fire, like a predatory animal, crept closer and closer to the princess's feet, and Chelsea only screamed, "Stop!" or "Hot!" When the flames reached the clothes and set them on fire, Leo reminded the girl that she still had a choice and could cooperate, to which she agreed. But even after Chelsea's consent, the young man was in no hurry to let the beast go and ordered her to swear that she agreed to cooperate in the name of her family. The poor thing screamed at the top of her voice that she swears by the name of the Revelin family that she will cooperate and is not doing it for reasons of deception. And Leo, in turn, pulled the liana and thought like the hero Kyle that children are quite easy to manipulate if you know their weaknesses. The rope loosened and Chelsea fell down screaming, realizing that she would land right in the fire. But the young man had his own plans for that. The princess opened her eyes when she felt that she had landed not on the ground or flames, but as if she was hanging in the air. As it turned out, Leo caught the girl and held her in his arms, and at the same time, she heard from him that he was glad to cooperate with the magician Revelin. While the students were busy with the most important task of survival in the wild forest, the examiner and other spectators were watching them in the hall. Harvey immediately noticed for himself that none of the students met the standard, and most of them chose simply beating or murder, blindly following his instructions to survive, thereby automatically earning the label of idiots. The examiner's opinion was different only regarding the two students he observed, since only they grasped the essence of what was happening. Next to the dismembered monster stood Celia and Abbott, and they achieved such a result only thanks to their joint efforts, since they complemented each other, and such students in Arvy's eyes were reliable hands of the future of the nation. The examiner was about to stop following the course of action, but his attention was drawn to another couple who were also working together to kill an orc that was 10 times larger than them. When Chelsea immobilized the orc, Leo cut off the limbs, and Arvy noted for himself at that moment that although the young man had acted immaturely by scaring the princess with fire, but having thus earned the cooperation of Revelin herself, he received a passing grade automatically. The examiner did not detect in Leo Flo's personality any strength or grace like Abbott or Celia. But there was something else and more interesting in the guy, namely the unpredictability of a dark horse. The wind sickle and wind arrow did their job, leaving a gaping hole in the orc's body, and Leo finished off the ghoul by cutting off his head with his sword. As the carcass fell to the ground and Leo climbed down, Chelsea admitted out loud that working with the knight made the task much easier. The young lady was eager to find out the secret, and she directly asked the guy what attribute's aura he was using, telling him that she absolutely could not detect it, to which he briefly replied that he did not use aura. Chelsea was shocked and did not understand how the young man managed without an aura, to which he said that he had a good base, so he was doing great, and so the guys communicated without noticing that they were already being watched. Leo decided to ask Princess Revelin if she put, for example, wind magic. Then, in her opinion, what is the basis, and she activated her power, so the guy thought that she wanted to demonstrate the answer. But the next moment, the girl's eyes shone like never before, and it no longer looked like an ordinary conversation. Suddenly, for Leo, the princess extended her hand forward, shouting out a sickle of wind, and directed the power into the bushes, which was strange. Only when the guys got closer, they saw the result of Chelsea's clear hit on target, which not everyone could have caught, and even hit blindly. The princess exhaled with slight indignation, now answering the guy's question that it was rather brazen to discuss wind magic in front of Revelin herself. Leo was not shy about his straightforwardness, so he told the girl that she was indeed gifted, but did not know how to use her power correctly, and this infuriated her. Chelsea was about to start getting indignant, but Leo felt a threat in the back of his head that he couldn't see with his eyes. You might think that the guy asked the girl to stop and wait just for fun, so that she would finally shut up, and it worked. But in reality, something bad was really waiting for them nearby. Walking on the ground, the young man felt a clot of negative energy that spread like black smoke. The guys approached a clearing where corpses lay, and when Leo touched one of them, the flesh crumbled like ash, to which Chelsea pointed out that they looked like mummies, and the guy concluded that he had already met a creature that leaves its victim in such a state. At the moment Leo realized the conditions of the exam, a strong explosion occurred very close to the guys, and all he managed to do was cover Chelsea with his body. After the explosion, enemies approached the guys, and one of them said in a disappointed voice that they had almost managed to eliminate the weaklings, and also gave an instruction that they first needed to kill Chelsea Revelin. One of those who quietly, like a rat, wanted to get rid of the opponents was Gullivan, and as he approached, he informed his partner that the second opponent was a dud. Gullivan shouted to his servants to attack all at once, but Leo was already ready to scratch his fists on the rats' faces. The young man without a sword hit the first one, who managed to get closer with his bare hands, which may have even broken his neck. Chelsea sat on the ground in shock, just as Gullivan was horrified, and the one Leo hit was completely passed out. Only now the young man asked his partner to cover his back, since there were many of those bastards, and the girl hesitantly answered yes, but at the same time she looked at the one she considered an enemy in a different way. Gullivan did nothing but give commands left and right, and the dogs obediently listened to him and went on the attack. But against those who stood ready, there was not a single chance. Now Leo decided to allow himself to go wild like he did during training with Celia, when he showed her a piece of his power. And so poor Gullivan runs through the dense forest away from what he called Leo, the Empty One, who, as it turned out, was scarier than one might have thought. The rat ran, but at the same time, she boldly declared in her head that she would not retreat so easily, and now she just needed to find another team of loyal dogs. Gullivan's sparkling heels were noticed by Celia, who did not understand why he was running away and suggested that Abbott go in the direction from which the young man was running. When the students arrived at the scene, they were in shock because they certainly did not expect such a turn of events. In the middle of the clearing with dead students and orcs, Chelsea and Leo stood like two flowers, not noticing that the guys had found them. But Princess Revelyn still had good hearing, and when she turned around, she was beside herself with happiness when she saw her brother. Chelsea almost knocked her brother down, but he was glad that his sister was safe. But Celia was more interested in why Leo and Abbata's sister were together. Leo answered as is, that he offered the girl cooperation, but specified that she was stubborn and did not want to agree to anything. The young man smiled maliciously and added that his persuasiveness had taken over, and since Celia knew that Princess Revelyn was really difficult to persuade and the guy was still smirking, she immediately asked what he had done. Leo did not stand idly by but went to those who were still able to continue the exam and helped them get up. Chelsea, out of misunderstanding, asked why Leo was helping those who just wanted to kill them, because without competitors it would be easier. While the other students were helping each other, Leo explained that they didn't need to fight each other because that's what this world is for. One of the guys mockingly asked if the guy had really lost his head so much that he was going to fight the world, but he didn't react in any way. The young man continued to tell that there was an anomaly in the wild forest and asked to take a close look at the corpses. Stepping on the remains of the corpse, the guy explained that it looked like all the juices had been squeezed out of them and only the shell remained. But the fact about the corpses was not all that Leo wanted to say. So he asked everyone where, in their opinion, all the monsters that should be roaming around here had gone. Celia was in shock at the moment that there really should have been a lot of evil spirits and at every step, so she admitted that the guy was right. Leo explained to the guys that all the monsters seemed to be hiding, afraid of encountering something more terrible, and that this something was most likely a high-ranking monster that had settled here, displacing everyone else. Abed said that he understood the young man's thought, and to clarify, he asked that it turns out that the hero Arvi wants them to kill the main monster, to which Leo nodded. Literally immediately after the students' conversation, a bright source of light and an eerie sound that did not resemble any living creature appeared near them. The guys stood frozen in shock and even forgot how to breathe, but not Leo, because instead he confirmed to everyone that this is why they came here and was already ready to fight. Gullivan's attempts to run away were successful, but finding someone turned out to be problematic, so he walked with his staff very slowly with trembling knees, because he also heard that terrible sound. Since there was no one around, the magician decided to shout into the air that he would do everything possible to make Deoflo fail the exam. The light from the staff didn't illuminate the path very well, but Gullivan noticed something on the ground that looked like a corpse. When the young man finally saw the body, which was no longer like anything else, he fell backwards out of fear, still screaming. It was unclear from where and what it was. A huge drop of an incomprehensible liquid fell onto the guy's staff and spread towards his hand. Instead of an answer, several more huge drops of an incomprehensible liquid fell on Gullivan's head, and then he froze, and all that could move were his eyes, which turned approximately in the direction from which the terrible sound was coming. When the young man finally dared to raise his head, he saw a huge spider above him, and it immediately responded to the movements of its future victim with a chilling growl. Arvi did not miss anything that happened to the students who were important to him, and how they met was no exception. Some of the exam participants had already returned to the school hall and were incredibly proud of how many opponents they had killed, which did not show them in the best light. Mr. Arvi concluded that approximately 500 students had failed and were either killed or had misunderstood the assignment. Another teacher ran up to Professor Arvi and sounded the alarm that they needed to select at least 100 students, since other regions had managed to do this, and now they only had 50 people left in the test. The examiner adjusted his glasses and dryly replied that if the participants did not meet the standards, then it would be better if he did not admit any of them at all, since the head of the Caltan Academy had appointed him responsible for the entrance exam, understanding everything. Arvi watched as Leo helped those who survived and thought that this was how a real hero is born in difficult times. The professor also noted for himself that it was Leo Flo who noticed the anomaly in the forest and was the only one who was able to do this. The question remained open, whether the dark horse would be able to stand up to the world he had been thrust into. The boys ran towards the light that appeared after Leo explained that there was something in the forest that was scarier than the rest of its inhabitants. The light source that emanated from the main test was quite bright, so the closer the students were to the target, the more their eyes were blinded. At some point, Celia stopped and, raising her sword up, touched something, so she warned the others to be ready. The more the princess plunged her sword into the strange substance, the brighter the red color emanated from it. When there was a lot of light, everyone saw that the sword was resting against the protective field of that spider, and now he was just busy eating Gullivan. The boys were taken aback by what they saw because they imagined anything but a huge spider that eats everyone who appears in the forest. Abbott raised his staff and shouted, "Windsickle!" after which it lit up to attack the monster. But Leo intervened in time, stopping the young man and turning to Gullivan to break his sphere, because it is better to lose than to die. A little more and the guy's head would have fallen to the ground, but the magician heard his opponent's words and mentally agreed with them. Gullivan broke the sphere, which fortunately he still hadn't lost, running through the forest and attacking opponents. The spider was not happy that the delicious human flesh evaporated right from his mouth, leaving behind only a trail of golden smoke. Now Prince Revlin could focus on killing the monster, and repeated the full attack of the Windfang only this time. Aiming his staff at the target, Abbott was indeed able to pierce the monster, from which blood immediately began to flow and it screamed terribly. No one expected to see that the next moment, instead of dying, the spider was whole and invisible, and the huge wounds were healing as if someone had stitched them up. Absolutely everyone's mouths dropped open at this sight, except of course Leo, because he already knew where this was all heading, since he had already been in this forest in his past life. Right now, the former hero Kyle was looking at that very spider princess Tarantula, who had been running the parade here for a long time. One of the students whom Leo helped to get up decided to try his own strength now, so with a cry of, "Bite me, nit," he flew at the spider, thinking that he would definitely be able to kill it. But the guy didn't even have time to fly to the target because Tarantula hit him with her paw, and he flew over Chelsea's head to where he started running from. The poor thing hit a tree and fell, and now Celia decided that it was her turn to make sure that this creature finally died. So she prepared to deliver just one decisive blow. Having imbued her sword with mana, the princess shouted the attack flaminance, and a red-charged ball appeared at the tip of the weapon. Celia pointed the sword straight at the spider's head, and the ball turned into a red beam that pierced the creature through and through. Literally immediately after, the hole in the head disappeared without a trace, as if nothing had ever gotten there, although in that case the monster should have fallen dead. Celia was in shock, and it was hard for her to believe what she just saw because she knew how much she had put into the attack. Abbott entered the battle again, emphasizing to Celia that the difference between the destructive power of a knight and a magician was like the difference between heaven and earth. The guy confidently said the Rafal spell, intending to finish off the monster once and for all. The spell swirled around the base of the staff in a strong vortex, indicating its power, and it was difficult for anyone to stand on their feet due to such a flow of wind. The tarantula was lifted off the ground and blood began to spray from her body again as she screamed furiously in pain and anger. Abbott froze in the air, waiting to see if he had managed to kill the monster, and it was still difficult to understand. Suddenly, a jump was heard that cut through the silence in the air, and the guy saw that same monster above his head. The spider attacked the guy, opening her sharp paws and mouth with the same teeth, and from the sound she made, his body was covered in cold sweat. Chelsea was scared for her brother and shouted attack the destructive wind, which did not save him from injury, but at least managed to save his life. When Abbott landed on the ground, his sister immediately asked if he was okay, to which he answered in the affirmative and thanked her for saving him. The student who was thrown into the tree by Tarantula had already recovered and was looking in horror at the unkillable insect, shouting out what was wrong with it. Everyone stood looking at the spider, asking the same question as the guy, since this was the first time they had seen such a terribly fast regeneration. The tarantula made a terrible sound and prepared to attack again since its victims were inactive. Only one of them stood in front of the monster, looking straight into her eyes, and told the others that in front of them was the daughter of Salanta, the queen of Tartaros, and that this was one of the monsters of the army of Erebos that destroyed the elven forest. Celia knew that Leo was crazy, but when she heard about such knowledge, she no longer knew whether to believe his words or not. Leo finally realized that the mana in Arvi's left eye that he felt before the exam definitely belonged to the Fairy King. As for Tarantula, she rules in the Cursed Forest, which is why she was considered an enemy who came there one day. Leo knew from his past incarnation that the spider destroyed the elf forest and bit off the right hand of the Fairy King who fought with her, but at the same time, the hero thought that Luna was still able to kill the monster. Only considering that the monster is still alive, this speaks of his salvation thanks to the king's right hand, which ended up in the stomach, or, to be more precise, thanks to the ring of life on this hand. Abet decided to take the test into his own hands again for a higher score, and already pointed his staff at the spider, and Celia was outraged by such selfishness. The guys decided to try to attack Tarantula together, and use both fire and air on her at once. But the interaction of the two elements did not help, because the wounds on the monster healed instantly, no matter how many there were and no matter how serious they were. Leo tried to convince everyone that this creature would regenerate infinitely until everyone ran out of mana. The tarantula stood in place for a while its wounds healed, since this time Abbott and Celia had tried hard. Princess Zerdinger turned to Leo with concern in her eyes and asked what he was proposing in that case, to which he replied that they now needed to try to work together. Abbott seemed to not care what the young man had warned him about, and he sharply replied that he did not need anyone's help, since the highest score was more important, and Celia also entered into this discussion. Leo made a last attempt to convey the truth to the guys, explaining that if they do not destroy the hero's world, they will all fail the test together. Only with such an ultimatum did the most obstinate and stubborn students finally fall silent and think about Leo's words. With some disbelief, Abbott reproachfully told Leo that even if they worked together, it would take a lot of time to find a way to kill the creature in one go. And on top of that, no one else except him and Celia was able to hold the monster back. Celia responded silently to Abada's remark since she partly agreed, but then she immediately turned her gaze to Leo as if she knew that he was about to say something else. Chelsea also looked at the guy's back of the head, hoping for his plan, which had not yet been voiced, but having been with him for a while in a pair against rivals and other monsters, she was confident in it. Leo looked at the guys with a smile and briefly replied that he too could go against this creature. The dark horse went forward to the target, to which Celia reacted quite violently, as for the one who herself recently wanted to kill the upstart, but now she shouted at him that this was suicide, considering that he could not use aura. Leo answered Celia that he was aware of everything she had just said and said that he could buy them a maximum of 5 minutes, but then Abbott's nerves got the better of him, and she asked what if they didn't succeed. The young man turned to such a disturbing question from the most daring of all the guys and again simply smiled. And when Leo approached a weapon more serious than a sword and leaned towards it to take it, he finally answered that he didn't think it would work. Before moving towards his old girlfriend, the guy turned to the guys once again and reminded them that wind and fire have always been a great pair, so they will work well together. The boys turned to each other, and after Leo's words about the elements, an awkward silence hung between Abbott and Celia. Leo walked towards Tarantula, exhaling so nostalgically as if he saw an old comrade whom he had missed in his own way. The young man smiled at the familiar feeling inside that reminded him of the old days with his friends and the fight against evil. For Leo, the battle with the spider was entertainment because he seemed to be playing with a puzzle in which he cut off a leg and it again sprouted shoots, and so he alternated them. The guy admitted to himself, chopping off another paw of the monster, that he had already forgotten this feeling of battle. Celia and Abbat almost dropped their jaws watching the young man they had so underestimated fight, and Leo at that moment seemed to be enjoying the process. The young man had a mixed feeling of joy inside him because he seemed to be back in action, and he had missed it. And because of this, he was glad to see the monster Tartaros because it was she who gave him these feelings even though he chopped her into pieces. Long before the exam, the elven inhabitants of the wild forest fled from the monster that Erebos sent here so that he could easily cope with his task. The elven child could not keep up with the adults, and although he tried to escape from his terrible fate, he still ended up in a sticky web. The unfortunate child begged for mercy, despite the fact that before him was a bloodthirsty monster that knew no compassion and always felt only hunger. The tarantula opened its mouth full of saliva and sharp teeth, preparing to swallow another easy prey, and the baby could only call for help, looking his death straight in the eye. When the boy closed his eyes to make it all end faster, the first thing he said to himself was the word mom. At the very last moment, the child heard a scream that called for the creature to retreat back, and a bright light hit the boy's face. But because of the tears he had shed, it was difficult for him to fully see who had come to save him. Behind the spider, the silhouette of a powerful and brave elf was visible, walking towards the monster, holding a staff in front of her. Then Luna, the very heroine who fought alongside Kyle against Erebos, turned to Tarantula and calmly but angrily informed the spider that she dared to break into her homeland and take the ruler's right hand. Luna immediately activated her mana against Tarantula, and it looked like the insect was about to be wiped off the face of the earth. The energy at the core of the moonstaff became incredibly strong and accumulated before striking the enemy. In the blink of an eye, there was an explosion from which the trees almost fell to the ground, and the bats left such a dangerous place like birds under threat. When the smoke cleared, the light appeared again, but this time it looked different, and a male voice was heard, which said that he would never have thought that the filth of Erebos would reach this place. Another hero approached the boy who was still in the sticky web, and this time it was Kyle. But the child, having experienced so much horror, no longer knew who to trust, so he was very scared. But the knight still approached the poor fellow, and asking if everything was okay with him, began to tear the web and pull the boy out of it. Taking a break for a moment of nostalgia, Kyle returned to the incarnation where he is Leo, but like last time, he looked at the spider who had not changed at all. The guy focused again on the fact that he needed to distract Tarantula, while Celia and Abbott developed an attack. But the problem now was that the young man felt his strength gradually running out without mana. Leo turned to Chelsea and she responded and was ready to help, but still reacted timidly to the young man after she showed her that he was not a weakling but a real hero. The young man, without turning away from the enemy, asked his partner to use wind magic to direct the weapon lying on the ground towards him. The tarantula caught on to the little creature's cunning plan and tried to crush it with its huge paw, but it jumped back in time. Chelsea was not quite ready to carry out the task because if Leo moves, the weapon flying towards him could injure him too, and she warned him about this. But the young man turned to his friend for a moment and asked her not to be afraid, but to trust him because he would intercept the weapon, and hurried the girl. Chelsea activated her powers and finally asked what kind of weapon she needed to give the guy, but he shouted that any would do and continued to deal with the monster at the same time. Leo, in addition to further distracting Tarantula, also concentrated on the sound made by the blade of the weapon flying towards him. Having jumped into the air, the guy decided to have some fun and began to guess whether it was a yataghan and a 1.5 sword flying towards him. And when he caught in his hands what he was thinking about, his strength increased and the battle took on new colors. So descending back to the spider, he asked to try the new weapon. Leo mercilessly and on the fly cut up both the body and the paws of the monster, trying to buy as much time as possible for the guys. But Tarantula was not far behind either, and many weapons were broken on her. So Leo immediately gave Chelsea a signal, briefly informing her with the word more, which indicated a new portion of iron. The girl carefully watched to make sure that the weapon got into the guy's hands as quickly as possible, spending as much force as was necessary on it. Leo got his hands on all sorts of weapons, but fortunately there were enough of them, and he knew how to use absolutely everything. The guys, looking at how incredibly dexterously Leo copes, were stunned by the fact that he is their age and fights so spectacularly that it was worthy of the god of battle and nothing less. Abad admitted out loud that he was taking back his words about the guy being far from small fry, but Celia didn't say anything about it because he had already figured it out himself. Tarantula made her own adjustments to the dance with the enemy, and blood started flowing from the wound on Leo's face, but he turned to the others with a smile, thinking that he was still capable of much. Taking hold of the sword tightly, the young man decided that if he couldn't defeat such a bug, then his friends from his past life would turn over in their graves, and he didn't want that. Striking the spider with all his might, Leo shouted the signal word more to Chelsea as half of the sword broke off. Poor Chelsea looked at the guy with alarm in her eyes and shouted that there were no more weapons, and then Leo fell out from this information. But Celia called her friend in time, shouting at him to step aside as they prepared the necessary spells to destroy the creature. Celia pointed her staff at Tarantula and said some cool words like "burn in hell, you bastard," and incinerated her with a fiery hurricane. Considering that only dust remained from the insect, the ring that had been preventing the monster from being killed all this time fell to the ground with a loud sound. At the moment of the destruction of the target, An announcement appeared that in the world of the hero RV, the Wild Forest chapter had been successfully completed. Celia fell to the ground, exhausted but relieved that finally this creature was really dead, and now she could breathe a sigh of relief. The girl looked at Leo from afar and was amazed at how he single-handedly held back the monster for really 5 minutes, as he said. Just as Princess Zerdinger was about to tell the young man that he had done a great job, she was interrupted by Chelsea, who was sitting behind her, shouting that what Leo had done was amazing. Princess Revelin couldn't contain her admiration and told Leo that he looked like a hero from Legends, to which he sarcastically asked if that was really the case. And Chelsea, not understanding this, asked him to teach her close combat because she was a layman at it but wanted to become a combat mage. Celia also threw around a bit of sarcasm, wanting everyone to experience Leo's training firsthand, something Chelsea also didn't understand. Leo approached the most important end of the fight for him personally and bent down to pick up the ring of the Elven King. Looking at the jewel, the guy didn't quite understand at first whether the ring had simply fallen out of the creature, but he didn't have to think or guess for long because a creature with wings appeared in front of the young man, as if it had freed itself from the decoration. Leo looked at the kid who was also looking at the hero in response and smiling at him, and the guy tried to understand if it was Prince Silid in front of him. In order not to miss such an opportunity, Leo immediately asked Silid if he remembered him and introduced himself as Kyle. The baby didn't say anything but smiled in response, closing his eyes, which clearly meant a positive answer, and his radiance increased. The glow gradually faded, and the guy thought that most likely Silid managed to become the king of the fairies. But the next question that interested him was about whether Arvi might own the Eye of Mana because of the treasure in the form of a ring. Arvi informed the students that the countdown to the return of the testing ground to its original position had begun, and indeed, the world seemed to be crumbling. When the countdown was literally a few seconds away, someone in a robe appeared in front of Leo and announced that the reward for passing the oath of the Fairy King. The space became like nothing at that moment, and Leo seemed to hang in the air, looking at the stranger and trying to understand whether this was the person he was thinking about or not. Meanwhile, the city was bustling with life, and people were walking back and forth, each going about their business, and all of this could be observed from a bird's eye view. That very bird was Kalyan Beidan, a swordmaster and director of the Lumen Academy, who was just reading the results about the fact that the exam in the Western lands had come to an end. The mentor was shocked by such news and disappointedly said that in the other lands the tests had only just begun, but there was nothing to do, and she asked how much Arvi had managed to gain. Mr. Kalyan clarified that given Arvi's methods, he had recruited quite a lot, as many as 40 people, to which the mentor asked if the director really thought that was a lot, and he laughingly said that he had not expected even more than 10 and asked her not to swear. Even before finishing reading, the director was thinking out loud about whether Celia or Abbott got the highest score, and it was difficult to determine this, which was confirmed by Arvi himself. And in addition, he nominated a candidate for the post of first-year class leader. The mentor was surprised that the professor was recommending someone and asked who it was, Celia or Abbott. Mr. Kalyan said that he had never heard such a name before, and this made the girl even more nervous. As it turned out, while the students were watching the final battle of their former rivals and shouting either Celia or Abbott, Mr. Arvi was drawing other conclusions for himself. The professor was already confident in the choice he had made, and all that was left was to put it down on paper for official confirmation. Arvi was stingy with conversations, and if he watched the test in silence, then in the document he wrote that he recommends Leo Flo for the post of first-year headman in the Knights Department, the reason for which is the talent to be a hero. The director of the Lumen Academy, after reading the document, stated that such praise from Arvi himself aroused interest in who this young and talented student was. After the ordeal, pain and fatigue could only be cured with time and care, which in this case for Leo was hot baths. The young man dove headfirst into the water to clear his mind, but instead, the moment of meeting the stranger who rewarded him for passing the test with the oath of the Fairy Kings came to mind. When the guy was above water again, he thought that there was no reward for the test, but he still received it, and it was only with him that it did not give him peace. Leo heard someone enter the hall and turn towards the doors, not knowing who it was since he wasn't expecting anyone. Mrs. Reyna entered the hall, but her appearance also surprised the son, since he too had not expected her visit in any case, and his mother looked even more humble than usual. Leo's premonitions about his mother's condition were confirmed when she asked him if he knew why she was expelled from the Zerdinger house, which left the guy in shock. But Reina continued to explain that everything happened because she had to sacrifice the Zerdinger flame to save her colleague. Leo saw how his mother felt even physically uncomfortable about this, and he himself became sad. But she immediately made it clear that she still does not regret the decision she made then. Miss Reina was encouraged when she asked her son to channel his strength and talent in the right direction and congratulated him on entering Lumen Academy. That day, the gates to Lumeria were especially active as many new recruits arrived after the exam. Leo was no exception among such guests in Lumeria, and when he stepped onto its lands, he heard a warning to check his belongings before leaving the main gate. The young man watched from the hill over the center of the Lumeria continent, and beyond the pond one could see the Lumen Academy itself. Considering what the students studied at the academy, it is not surprising that it is not located in the city itself, and you still had to get to it. Leo didn't notice right away, but someone was approaching him and asking how he spent the entire last month. The guy recognized the man as his uncle Zeus, and after greeting him, heard congratulations on passing the exam, to which he thanked him and asked what brought him here. Zeus began to explain from a distance that there had been heated debates in their house for the past month, and asked his nephew if he could guess what the arguments were about. Leo immediately realized that this was a debate about deciding whether to pass on the phoenix's breath to him or not, to which his uncle answered in the affirmative. Zeus stuck his hand under his coat and continued to tell her that his sister was no longer part of the family and that Leo was her son. The gentleman took a key from under his coat and gave it to the boy, adding that the elders were also very surprised by his passing the infamous exam of the Western lands. While Leo was looking at the thing, which was as beautiful as it was strange, Zeus explained that he was holding a spatial key in his hands. The next moment, the uncle asked his nephew to make a hand gesture as if he were opening a door, and he tried, after which there was a click like in a keyhole. And turning the key, Leo saw in front of him something like a door from which a book appeared, and Zeus stood in front of the young man all this time. When the book opened and began to turn the pages by itself, the light from it was so bright that the guy even covered one eye. At one point, the book stopped turning pages and stopped, but they were empty, and something was missing to reveal the text. Zeus prompted Leo to sprinkle a drop of his blood on the pages, and he, without fear, bit his hand a little to see what would happen next. The young man was fearless, so he dripped more blood than was possible and necessary, but the most important thing was done. The pages of the book shone even brighter after being sprinkled with blood, and now it was interesting not only to Leo, but also to Mr. Zeus. After the symbols appeared, the uncle told his nephew that from now on, only he could read this book and it would not be available to anyone else. Zeus placed his hand on the boy's shoulder in a friendly manner and warned him that learning the Zerdinger's secret technique would not be easy, but at the same time expressed his confidence that Leo would master it in the shortest possible time. Before saying goodbye, the uncle congratulated his nephew on his successful joining the Zerdinger family. Leo was walking around the city looking at its sights, and when he reached the establishment's summer terrace, he stopped. The guy was focused on finding Celia because she suggested meeting somewhere in this place. But because of this, he did not notice how someone was walking towards him with a stack of books. Someone, having encountered an obstacle that he did not see because of a mountain of books, dropped the entire stack onto the ground. Leo sat on the ground, not quite understanding what had happened, and the girl crawled on all fours, burning with shame. The poor thing was so confused and so embarrassed in front of the stranger that at first she just stared at him, not even knowing what to say. Leo also looked at the girl, unable to move from shock, but she had already come to her senses and, quietly muttering apologies to the gentleman under her breath, gathered her books. The girl had already rushed away with the speed of the wind, and Leo didn't even have time to say anything to her, but he realized that they would most likely see each other again when he noticed that there was something on the floor that belonged to the student. The guy got his hands on nothing other than the girl's ID card, which stated that she was Chloe Miller, and she was also a new student at Lumen Academy. The doorbell rang and the shop doors creaked open, but instead of the shouts of the sellers or customers, there was silence. But the silence didn't last long because Celia immediately attacked Leo with a complaint about why he was walking somewhere for so long. Princess Zerdinger already had a bunch of shopping bags in her hands, but she still told her friend that they still had to buy books, uniforms, and other necessary things. Leo asked for forgiveness and answered his friend directly that Uncle Zeus had detained him, to which Celia chattered even more about whether the elders had really made a decision and immediately wanted to know how everything went, completely forgetting about shopping. The guy decided not to tell, but to immediately show what he had already learned, and after that, asked a little pathetically if he was using the technique correctly. Not believing what she was seeing, Celia dropped all her shopping bags and her legs gave way. Leo noticed the girl's reaction and he was pleased with himself, knowing that it only took him 3 weeks to get acquainted with the technique. And Celia, having fallen to the floor, could not contain her surprise, which was visible on her face. But in her head again was the question of who the hell this Leo was. It was time to take the liner to Lumen Academy, and the students were standing waiting to board as well as Leo and Celia. When the ship began to dock, it caused many to be delighted with its dimensions, and at that moment, the person responsible for them on the trip, and not only was already approaching the students. Celia was a little scared by the sudden appearance of Professor Ein Elandier when he came to greet the newcomers and introduce himself as the one in charge of the first years of the night class, since he was also an ice attribute knight. Mr. Ein loudly announced for the students to board as the departure for Lumen was soon. The huge liner cut through the waves of the lake heading towards the new monastery for the students. The professor enjoyed his wine while watching the new recruits, who also relaxed while enjoying the treats that had been prepared for them for the duration of the trip. Only Leo simply walked along the deck without touching the food, and just like Ein, he watched everyone, and Celia, for now, stayed close to her friend. Suddenly, someone called the guys as a couple, which made Leo neither cold nor hot, but Celia was horrified by such a statement. The guy introduced himself as alchemist Carl Thomas from the Kingdom of Moira, and proudly declared that he knew everything from potions to weapons. Carl handed a piece of paper to Leo, telling them not to hesitate to contact him if they needed anything at the academy. Celia was still outraged by Carl's statement that she and Leo were a couple, so she had no intention of getting acquainted and turned away. And Leo introduced himself as being from the Kingdom of Delan, and Carl immediately recognized him as the one who had passed the infamous exam. Carl wanted to say something else, but Leo interrupted him, asking the guys if he was the only one who thought the situation on the ship was strange, but the guy didn't understand what he was talking about. Leo explained that it was too peaceful on deck, which made him feel uneasy, but Celia did not understand her friend's suspicions, since this was nothing more than a warm greeting to the newcomers. The next moment, Leo looked at Professor Ein, but he was carelessly sipping wine and looking into the distance. Carl took another treat and, with his mouth full, agreed with Celia that those who were transporting them had no need to torment the students even before the distribution. But literally right after the guy's words, the ship began to sail as if it had hit an underwater reef, and again Leo stood confidently on his feet because he knew that something similar would happen, while others could barely stand. Leo's suspicions took the form of a huge tentacle that emerged from the water, and this was only part of what was about to appear. Everyone started running around in panic and screaming what was going on, until one of the tentacles hit the deck right in front of Carl. The students rushed around the deck and called for help from Professor Ein, who in turn continued to enjoy the wine, ironically pretending not to understand what the students were telling him. Despite the fact that the ship was about to sink and everyone on it would either drown or be eaten, Ein took another calm sip of the drink. The next moment, the professor turned to the students and reminded them that they were Lumen students and candidates for heroes, so when danger befell them, they could only rely on themselves. After Ein's loud words, a monster about the same size as the ship, if not larger, jumped out of the water onto the ship, similar to an octopus, which could well mean that it was the Kraken itself. Relaxation and thoughts about desserts were gone, as a more interesting activity appeared, to which Leo ran first. Having cut the first tentacle like butter, the guy shouted to his friend to control herself, otherwise everything would only get worse. But Celia was also keeping up with slicing seafood, so she told Leo to think about his ass. The Kraken reacted quite sharply to the girl's fiery nature and shot a stream of water at her that left no dry spot, causing the poor thing to scream. Flo, even with a hint of disappointment in his voice, told Celia that this was the Kraken's natural reaction to the heat, so he splashed water and reminded her that this was a base, which angered the girl. The Kraken finally managed to grab Carl, and if it weren't for his screams, Leo and Celia wouldn't even have noticed the loss. But cursing at the damn octopus, the guys ran to Carl straight along one of the tentacles to free him. The students, although they competed in their own way to see who could best deal with the monster, worked together in a coordinated manner to speed up the process of dealing with it. Finding himself back on deck, Carl decided that this time he would rather hide under the table so as not to disturb others and to save his own life. The young man watched the guy's work, and if Celia's reaction as a top student was clear to him, he did not understand what was wrong with the new guy, Leo. The poor guy turned as pale as snow when a tentacle fell in front of him, but not in its original form, but frozen, which even caused the deck to crack. Carl even crawled out from under the table, to express his indignation at what the culprit of such a mess was allowing himself to do. But Chloe continued to do her business, not paying much attention to the guy's shouts from the deck. Leo immediately recognized the girl as the modest stranger who had knocked him off his feet because of the pile of books that were blocking her view. And now Flo was looking at a rather strong and gifted person who was doing quite well with her mana. Chloe, without even turning around, told Carl that if he was unable to stand up for himself, then he could at least step aside and not interfere with his shouting. Carl was shocked by such speeches, not understanding whether the powers that be really don't care at all who gets hit. The young man's question was answered right at his feet by another huge severed tentacle, which frightened him again. But this was already the work of someone else. As always, brother and sister Revelin appeared in front of everyone in a refined manner, and they were also not averse to trying seafood. Leo noticed Chelsea's appearance more than Abitaz, especially when she informed Celia that their rivalry was not over yet, and she shouted back in reciprocity. So silently, Leo and Chelsea exchanged glances, and she flew off with her brother to deal with the monster. To each his own, Professor Ein was still pouring himself some wine, saying out loud that there were tons of monsters in the waters surrounding the academy. Looking at today's guest, Ein thought that the Kraken is the cannon for a welcoming party for new recruits. The professor had already noted for himself those who stood out, and these were undoubtedly the class monitors who were selected during the exams. The pretty girl Chen Xia, who came from the eastern lands and dealt well with the monster even in hand-to-hand combat. My eyes also fell on the equally strong and rather well-known Celia Zerdinger and Abbot Revelin, who had arrived from the west. Like her homeland, Chloe Miller of the north slew the Kraken with her chilling skills. It was also fascinating to watch Walden Tyden from the south tear apart a tentacle with his bare hands. Duran Moira from the central region showed himself to be brave and serious, and dealt with the monster no worse than others. Ein observed such a vivid display of diverse skills and acknowledged that the newcomers this year were quite outstanding. The professor decided to drink to such a successful admission because he would like to continue to observe such results of painstaking work. But the most impressive sight for Ein was a guy unknown until then who also had stunning results. The professor observed Leo's mastery of fencing without a single unnecessary movement, and when the guy does move, it's as if he's reading the Kraken's movements. Smiling, Ein thought that perhaps he would soon see a talented young man in his class. Finally, the ship docked and the students, leaving wet puddles behind them, barely trudged on their feet away from the water. Neither alive nor dead, Carl followed the others with frustration, and all because, due to his poor condition, he used up all his potion supplies. With one jump, Ein was next to the students, warning them that they would have to cross the lake quite often, so it was better to get used to such guests now. Now all that was left was to walk to the entrance to the academy, but this time on a hard surface, which was good news. The first years gathered at the Elekra training grounds, which was part of Lumen Academy. One of the students had already started discussing that they don't accept normal people, and another replied that it would be more fun with them, but their conversation was interrupted by the hosts, who announced that the admission ceremony was beginning. Ein asked the students to line up by region, and those who scored the highest score to stand in front. The host announced that the director would now give a speech, and Mr. Callion proudly stated that this year, as in all previous years, their ranks were replenished with new future heroes. The director warned that he would not belabor the point and would try to express the main idea in a few words. Mr. Callion made eye contact with each new student and reminded them that if they wanted to become heroes, they had to put in their best efforts. The director also added that training cannot be done without overcoming one's limits, even when it seems that one has reached the final stage. In order to make it clear who has a place in the academy and who does not, Mr. Callion shouted that those who already understood that they cannot be here, then they have no place in Lumen, and then hit the wooden stand so that it shattered. There was a deathly silence among everyone at the training ground, and chips from the stand were scattered under the director's feet. Turning to the teachers, Mr. Callion asked if he had overdone it, to which they tried their best to show that they were not in shock. But the director was pleasantly surprised by the fact that the students shouted joyfully in one voice after all the terrible things he told them. And while Callion was shouting to the recruits that he couldn't hear them, urging the crowd to make even more noise, the professors themselves didn't know whether to laugh or cry because the longer they taught, the more the image of the great swordsman faded. The host went to another stand and asked the first-year class leader to give his speech to the students. Some of the guys were shocked and speechless when they heard that Leo Flo was announced as the head of the first years. But there were also those who immediately concluded for themselves who would be their #1 competitor. Leo was no exception to those who were shocked by the news, but a slight chill ran through his body for literally a moment. The guy looked forward where Ein and Arvi were standing, and at that moment, he was just asked to go on stage again. When Leo thought about whether it was Arvi who recommended him for the role of headman, a slight smile appeared on his face as if in confirmation. Leo went up to the stage where the stand had been before and, opening the text, began to read an address to the professors and senior students. And rumors and whispers were already spreading among the students that they had never heard of this flow, and the majority were sure that someone more famous would become the headman. While Leo continued to talk about how they, first years, now bear the honorary title of students of the Lumen Academy, one of the recruits already had a grudge against him, and in his thoughts he was already reading the guy's look and behavior. Having closed the book, Flo thanked everyone for their attention, and the presenter, in turn, thanked him for his performance. The host decided to keep the guy a little longer and asked if he would like to share his plans as a headman with everyone. Leo smiled at this statement, mentally thinking that the professor seemed to be doing it on purpose so that he would anger the candidates for his place as headman. The young man decided to play by the rules of the academy and began to explain his plans. And behind his back, the teachers were already discussing the fact that he had the gift of speech, so the ceremony would go smoothly thanks to such an exemplary student. But the model student decided to follow the example of the impudent director and declared to everyone from the stage that if someone was aiming for his position, then they should first try to take it away. To say that the guys were shocked when they heard this is to say nothing, because again, while some opened their mouths, others, on the contrary, clenched their jaws in anger. And Leo continued to only make noise by looking at the crowd and warning that he was not joking now and would deal with any of the students, no matter who they were. When the sun had almost set, the students headed to the dormitory to occupy their rooms and put away their belongings. The first-year students went to rest knowing that from tomorrow and the entire next week, there would be introductory classes, and during this period they could, regardless of their preferences, attend any of them, which was necessary to choose 3 subjects for further study. Some of the students immediately went to look for their rooms, while others stopped for a moment to take a good look at everything and get their bearings. Room 302 belonged to Leo Flo, and when he was about to enter, he saw Carl nearby, who said that it turned out that they would be neighbors. Carl shared with his friend that he was already looking forward to tomorrow and wished Leo good night, to which he reciprocated. The room where Leo would be living for the near future was quite spacious but minimalistic, and the huge bed was only for him alone, so he immediately fell onto it, along with his suitcase. Closing his eyes, the guy immediately began to imagine why he really appeared at the Lumen Academy. Leo imagined how he opens the door to a place full of knowledge that he does not yet know, but he did not forget about the most important thing. The fantasy ran wild, and the young man found himself in a room full of shelves with books. Paper birds were flying around, and the target was lying on the top of the cliff. At the moment when Leo thought about the heroic protocol in which there are records about him, he appeared only in his past incarnation. The new school day started off great for the students because it took place in the cafeteria where they served quite appetizing food. Carl had already noticed Leo and suggested eating together, although he had already started his meal before his neighbor arrived. Flo simply accepted Carl's offer and continued eating, not paying attention to anything else. But as soon as the guy took a bite of the food, a tray of food fell on the table, and the student rudely addressed the head of the first years, to which Leo, as always, reacted calmly. As a top student in the Central Region, Duran Moira was eager to find out if what Flo had said during his acceptance speech was a lie. With his mouth full, the headman asked if his words had been so provocative that now all sorts of strangers would be itching to fight. Now Duran was furious that a brat from some village didn't know his best student in the Central Region. And indeed, both Leo and Carl totally ignored the top student, continuing to enjoy their food and drinks. Instead of leaving the boys alone, Duran went berserk right there in the dining room without even touching his food. Poor Carl froze with his fork and food on it in his hand, because right in front of him, it looked like ball lightning was about to explode. The top student decided that if he kicked the table with food into the air, he could scare Flo, but in fact he only showed himself as an idiot. Leo decided not to lag behind his classmate's interesting idea and jumped up from his chair like a spring. The guy had to unfortunately sacrifice his drink to catch the tray and assemble the burger back on the fly, and it wasn't even his own. Considering how happy Carl was, Leo managed to help him get the food back on the tray. Having dropped to the floor, Flo set his own record for a burger, or more precisely, a royal double cheeseburger, and there was also a drink nearby. All Leo told Duran was that throwing such delicious food, especially on the first day, was an unforgivable violation. Duran gritted his teeth and muttered that right here and now he would bring the upstart down to earth. The top student started shouting that he wouldn't allow anyone, especially such a weakling, to show off in front of him, but then he felt someone's hand on his shoulder. The boys were hugged by Mr. Ein himself, who briefly responded to Duran's threats with the word "we'll see," and he suddenly became quiet. Leo was calm, but wondered how Ein managed to appear here so unnoticed, while he seemed to be voicing the participants of the ring as a guy from the central region and a newly minted headman. The professor looked at both of them and commented with some disappointment that the guys had already started a fight in Lumen on the first day. And when Ein asked if the guys knew what awaited them, Leo only smiled because he understood that most likely it would be something like running, and he was trained, so he was confident, unlike Duran's nervous look. The introductory classes of the nightly department on the first day took place on a platform reminiscent of an arena for gladiators. The clock had already passed the start of the lesson, but Ein stood silently in front of the students, looking down at the ground as if waiting for something. One of the students raised his hand and reminded the professor that it was time to start the lesson, and at that moment Celia was looking around for Leo. A hand appeared from under the arch, and as it turned out, the offenders had been running to class the whole time, which is why the start was delayed. Still angry, Duran went to the others, but Leo stood still and Celia ran up to him, asking him what happened. Flo wiped the sweat from his face, and when Celia asked if he had already managed to fight, the young man looked towards Moira and said nothing. When Duran was at a sufficient distance, Leo explained to the princess how everything happened in the dining room. Professor Ein happily announced that since everyone was finally assembled, the lesson could begin, and greeted the newcomers with a smile as their teacher, reminding them that he was a Landier and responsible for training the night unit. Leo, although he was standing next to Moira, was focused on the professor and his words, but the top student could not stand still and kept glancing at the headman. Professor Ein stepped forward with one foot to begin explaining the 3 methods of enhancement that Mana provided. The teacher refreshed the recruits' memory by reminding them of spiritual magical methods and aura as the third, while clarifying that aura is the most difficult to control, after which he asked the guys who knew why it was this way with aura. Celia replied that mana loses its fluidity in the process of being converted into aura, and Ein agreed with this. The mentor added to what was said that magical and spiritual energies are fed by mana in its natural form, and accordingly, the aura that consumes mana must adapt to the body of the owner. Having activated his power, Ein asked if anyone could explain how exactly the aura that accumulates in the body is used. Celia looked at her energy that was coming from her hand and mentally answered the professor's question that isn't the aura used simply as an emission through effort. To the surprise of all the students, Leo answered that the aura is used when mana is burned. Ein was glad that the dark horse was showing himself boldly, and therefore asked the next thing. Does he know what is the most important thing when burning mana? Duran was just about to open his mouth and answer when Leo was able to answer this question again, saying that endurance is important when burning mana. The professor, without hiding his admiration, directly told Leo that he was impressed by such knowledge and asked if the guy had studied the aura before. But Flo briefly replied that he had not studied the aura without looking for any excuses or being ashamed of it. Ein smiled at the young man's answer and thought to himself that it was quite a good ability to understand the essence without taking special classes, which was quite interesting. With the words, "It's time to put theory aside and warm up a bit," the professor took the first step, but not on the grass, but as if floating in the air. Many students were shocked by such a sight, although they knew that the possibilities of aura are limitless. But with Ein's help, it was still more spectacular. Elandir walked along the transparent circles like steps, higher and higher, indicating to the students that this is called the aura step, which is formed by a simple concentration of the aura in the legs. Having descended to the ground with the help of the same aura, the professor went to the students to tell them something else very important. Anticipating a spectacular lesson, Ein warned the students that the potential for using aura is limitless if you know how to use it correctly. While studying the new possibilities of their bodies, the time during the lesson flew by unnoticed by all the students. Someone tried to do the aura step as the teacher showed, but in the end he learned to hover in the air. Other students manipulated aura and mana in battle because they wanted to discover something new in what they already knew. Celia did it pretty quickly and she walked happily around the circles, after which she shouted to Leo that if he would kindly call her sister, she would teach him to do the same, which he refused since the principles of mastering the aura are the same everywhere. Duran also tried to do something with his aura, but his gaze was fixed on Leo, and Ein caught that moment. The guy tried to become invisible and was already worried that the professor had paid attention to him, which is why he began to bite his fingers out of nerves. But it was already too late because Ein realized that now was the right moment to give the guys the opportunity to let off some extra steam. The teacher clapped his hands to attract the attention of all the students and said that, as they remembered, there had been a small commotion in the cafeteria that morning. Chelsea stood next to Carl, and when she asked what the professor was talking about, he simply shrugged. But Carl wouldn't be himself if he didn't arm himself with a charismatic, cunning face and ask if the girl was really that interested, after which he added fuel to the fire and said that it was no joke, and this made the poor guy even more nervous. At that moment, Ein called Duran and Leo to him, so all that was left was to watch and listen. The professor got as close as possible to Moira's face, asking what had made him so angry this morning, to which he looked away and denied that he was not angry at all. If before this the mentor wanted to change his mind, then after such a lie he told his comrades to get ready. Ein officially called each guy by name and status, and then announced that they were having a one-on-one running competition for the place of headman. The professor also clarified that in this competition, participants can use aura without restrictions, which shocked Duran. Carl, as the main jester and ringleader, was already walking among the students and accepting bets. The alchemist loudly introduced the genius of the House of Moira from the Duran Hero League, who masterfully wielded the aura of the lightning attribute. And Carl introduced his opponent as a dark horse from the provinces and as a mysterious man who beat everyone in the entrance exam to become the head of the first years of Leo Flow. The students were divided into two camps, because some thought that the guy was chosen as a class leader because he could do something, while others learned from a conversation with Celia that he did not have an aura, and if being a top class leader was not just a title, then this Flow had not shown himself. Ein simply told the guys that the winner would be the one who crossed the finish line first, and regardless of who won, he had to accept the result because that was the essence of the competition. At the moment when the professor started saying, "At the start, attention," Celia already thought that Leo had no chance. And looking at the participants, the girl thought that this guy always exceeds all expectations. The mentor shouted march and the boys took off, but if Duran immediately broke ahead because he was fully charged with energy, Leo ran alongside without an additional booster. Moira didn't care that he was already ahead, so he turned around and shouted that he would be first no matter what, although he did it not for a simple reason, but because he felt real competition in the person of Leo. The students shouted and whistled in support of Duran, and at the same time became disappointed in the headman, who was running behind somewhere to the side. Flo perceived the competition as a game again, and now he was interested not so much in winning as in putting into practice what he had learned. If at the first meeting the guys praised the headman, now they were outraged at how bad he was and that he was clearly appointed by some mistake. At the same time, Chelsea supported Leo as much as she could with her strength and vocal cords by shouting at him that he was the best. Thanks to his lightning speed, Duran was already halfway across the distance, causing the crowd to go wild. Carl was shocked by how fast this crazy friend was, and plus he still voted more for Leo. Leo wasn't far behind his rival, but at the moment of the turn he looked at the wall and braked so hard that the soles of his shoes started smoking. Instead of catching up with Moira, the elder ran to the wall, which from the outside looked like flight or madness. Celia, also voting for Leo, watched now as this idiot ran to the wall and was shocked by what he was doing. But the guy had never made a mistake in his plans, and now he also knew perfectly well what he was getting into, so a fiery circle appeared under his feet. Having made several such jumps, thanks to the aura of his step, Flo found himself on the stands, and with each such action he became more and more mysterious to the others. Having stopped at the right point, Leo looked in the direction where Duran was running and prepared for the most interesting moment. The young man pushed off from the steps of the stand so that they cracked under his feet, as if he had not been standing on them, but had flown in like a meteorite. Feeling enough grip on the surface, Leo made something like a mega jump towards the finish line, which made Moira think it was like an explosion in the stands. Flo, at supersonic speed, rushed towards his opponent in order to still have time to catch up with him, and perhaps even meet his eyes. The guy did just that, because not only did he overtake Duran, he also made fun of him, saying that he would be first and calling him a slowpoke. Having reached the finish line, Leo slowed down like an airplane, leaving behind dust, smoke, and a trail of his aura. Duran ran up to the enemy already with disappointment and a sour expression, still not understanding what the hell happened. But Leo, although he became the winner, met Moira with a smile because he immediately accepted the moment not as a rivalry but as a game, and did everything out of interest and ease. Those who had changed their minds about Leo like 7 Fridays in a week now stood with their mouths open, not believing what they saw. The guys didn't understand how the new guy overtook the fastest Duran among the first years, despite the fact that Flo hadn't studied the aura step. Celia heard her classmates' conversation and mentally answered them that it was not an aura step at all, but a phoenix step, and she also could not believe what this idiot had done. But Carl and Chelsea couldn't get enough of their friend's victory, so they kept shouting that he was the best. Mr. Ein also followed the course of events the whole time, not missing anything, and noted for himself that Duran used his lightning aura to speed up. The young man's acceleration was expected, but the fact that he managed to develop incredible speed still amazed the imagination. At the same time, the professor could not help but notice that Leo, although he was lagging behind at the beginning, but at the same time, by controlling his attribute, he was able to focus the maximum amount of fiery aura in his feet, which formed a giant step. Flo also had such a thing as self-worth, so when Duran approached him, he extended his hand to him, saying that it had been a good competition, adding that if it had been at a long distance, the result could have been different. But Moira couldn't accept that the upstart had won, so he nudged him with his shoulder, told him to get away from him, and walked away. But Ein was glad that a true hero appeared in this generation, and this especially warmed his soul. Chelsea was so happy about Leo's victory that she was bursting with happiness, and she repeated to the guy again that she wanted to be able to do the same, so she asked him to train her. Carl was outraged why Chelsea was so obsessed with Leo, because he was no worse, to which Celia asked him if he was sure of what he said. Wanting to show that he too could be cool, Carl told everyone that since classes were over, it was worth celebrating the first day in the cafe, and said that he was treating everyone today. Only Leo asked for forgiveness and refused, asking to go without him, which the company did not understand at all. But the guy turned towards the exit without explaining anything. Only Carl decided not to back down so easily and asked where he was going, to which Flo said that he still had a call-up class. Carl asked out loud why a knight needed conscription training, and for the first time Celia agreed with the jester. And while Leo was walking to class, he was thinking about the fact that he didn't understand why the Fairy King gave him an oath as a reward. Remembering the encounter with the shadow in the wild forest, Flo knew very well that usually the reward in the hero's world is limited by the power of the creator. From the known information, it only follows that the reward that Leo received is more useful for the summoner. But at the same time, Professor Arvey is an ordinary magician not associated with summoning. The next point that Flo came to was the understanding that he had to receive some kind of magical prize, and in addition to everything, in order to conclude a contract with the fairy, he needed to go to their land, so for now the prize was useless. Leo was standing waiting for class when he heard a question from behind, asking if he was also called up for class. Flo immediately realized that in front of him was a top student from the East, and Chen Xia said that she was very glad to meet them. The young man reciprocated, but when he called the student by her full name, she asked him to call her simply Chen. Chen confessed to Leo that she was sure that he would choose the knightly division and did not think that he would be interested in conscription, to which the guy said that he was really more interested in spiritualism, and the girl was glad that they would see each other more often. Leo asked what spirit the student had signed a contract with, and she immediately showed it, asking him if the guy would show his spirit. Flo admitted that he had not yet made a magical contract, and Chen offered her help if necessary, since she could give a couple of useful tips for summoning. Having thanked Flo, he said that he would count on Chen and then asked how old she was. Chen said she was 17 and tried to guess if she was right, in thinking Leo was 15 because she accidentally overheard him and Celia talking. Instead of answering, Flo stared at the girl, not understanding how she could be 17 if she looked much younger, even younger than Chelsea. Because Leo was thinking for a long time, he looked at Chen, and this time she noticed that gaze. Chen pulled herself up to the guy, wondering what he was already thinking about, but Leo quickly looked away and tried to fall into the cold as much as possible and answer that nothing like that. The girl continued the conversation, saying that in any case, she was very impressed by the match between Leo and Duran. Leo was a little surprised that Chen was also watching and asked again if she really saw, to which she answered in the affirmative, and now again imagined the state she was in when she watched what the headman was doing. Chen turned to Leo and confidently told him that she hoped that one day he would accept her challenge as well. Flo liked this idea, and he honestly told the girl that he would of course accept her challenge. It would seem that this is what a person needs to be happy, but Chen, after she heard that they would compete with her, was extremely pleased. The introductory classes for the recruitment took place right on the rocky cliff. And besides Leo and Chen, many students had already gathered there. And even among these students, there were those who itched not only their teeth, but also their fists at Flo, so periodically such guys turned and cast a fierce look at the enemy. Among the envious and ill-wishers were those guys who fought with Leo on the deck of the ship against the Kraken. But at that moment, both Leo and Chen were standing waiting for the teacher, whom, frankly speaking, they had already been waiting for. Flo was a little disappointed, asking into the air if this was all that would happen, but Chen was nearby and replied that the call was not very popular, especially since they were currently in the process of familiarization. Leo said that he understood and was just about to finish saying that it was strange to conduct classes outdoors when he saw that Chen had stepped back. The girl stepped aside for a reason, because a huge winged creature appeared above them, which needed a lot of space to land. Those who knew that this creature was called a black wyvern shouted it out, but no one understood where it came from. The beautiful creature leaned over to one student to get to know him and sniff him, but the poor guy almost shit his pants, screaming for him to leave him alone. The woman climbed down from the wyvern, telling the idiot that the little girl had merely shown him her politeness by saying hello. Having stroked her winged friend, the woman greeted everyone else and introduced herself as Yura Marin. Yura reminded that she is the very teacher who will be teaching those who want to for the entire next year. The guys were drooling over such a beautiful view and even thought that they wouldn't mind becoming conscription teachers. Leo also recognized the beauty of the teacher, but more through the eyes of his former colleague Dveno, because if he were here, he would go crazy. And at the same time, the guy realized that the appearance of this woman is not similar to the one that Luna and Lucinus had, but she is inspiring. The wyvern playfully leaned on its wing and watched as Yura talked to the newcomers, asking them if they were already here, and they clearly had a talent for summoning, to which they all loudly answered in one voice, yes. The teacher liked how cheerfully the children answered, and suggested that in this case they immediately move on to practice. After Yura called Carlo, a griffin descended to the ground along with another teacher. The students were also assigned griffins, and Yura said that they would learn to ride the birds and work in pairs. One student, frightened by such large creatures, decided to remind the professor that this was their first time in contact with griffins, which could be dangerous. But Yura immediately cut off all uncertainty with the question of whether such a young guy really had any complaints about her methods of conducting lessons. When the professor jumped on the wyvern, she shouted at the guy to just leave if he was not confident in his abilities and strength. Sensing the mood of its mistress, the wyvern spread its wings and launched its furious roar into the air, causing vibrations to travel along the ground. Among the most excited students, the calmest was Leo, who watched the beautiful creature take off. Carlo was more gentle than Yura, so he asked to follow the teacher's instructions, and it would be better for everyone. The guys started getting to know their companions for this activity, and in one pair the girl was even sitting on the bird while the guy was petting it. On another occasion, the griffin decided that the young man needed help and lifted him above the ground with his strong beak. And when Leo was already sitting on the griffin, Chen came up to them and asked if she could lead him for the first time, to which he agreed. The pack crossed the expanses of the lake, led by Yura on a black wyvern, and the students couldn't be happier that they were assigned to griffins on the very first day, so they were once again convinced that the Lumen Academy is incredible. Chen was also delighted and admitted to Leo that she was worried about the griffin's temperament, but it turned out that he was a cutie, and the guy warned that vigilance should not be lost anyway because controlling a bird is not an easy task. The girl stroked the creature and asked Flo that she needed to be vigilant even though the griffin was kind. And just as the young man wanted to explain what the griffin's compliance consisted of, a whistling sound was heard from the direction where Yura was flying, to which all the creatures reacted. The birds seemed to have gotten out of control and became simply wild creatures again that stopped listening to any commands. At that moment, Leo finally finished saying that the thing was that the professor had been controlling them all this time. Yura pointed out to the students that if they were unable to cope with the griffins, it was too early for them to become Lumen students, so now they needed to try to control them themselves. Poor Chen screamed along with the griffin, unable to tame the wild beast, but she was lucky with her partner. Chen was almost stunned when she felt Leo put his arm around her waist and took her hand with his other hand, and when she asked what he was doing, he explained that griffins were proud creatures and trying to subdue them by force only made things worse. Since the guys couldn't change places now, Flo helped Chen control the griffin with his hand. The girl felt terribly awkward about the situation with such closeness, and she no longer knew what to do, so she simply froze, trusting her partner. The griffin stopped kicking and headed towards the wyvern, and because it gained altitude and speed, the wind was blowing into its face like crazy, so Chen closed her eyes, but Leo could see where they were heading. Yura noticed how Leo and Chen did and considered this result to be quite good for the first time. The professor turned to Carlo, asking him if the first-year class leader had applied to the nightly division, which he confirmed. Yura asked Carlo if the guy had a personal griffin at home, but he replied that Leo was not from a noble house that could own such creatures. The woman thought that Flo most likely had an innate gift and she really liked it. Looking at the guy again, Yura noted for herself that there was a possibility that they had received an uncut diamond. Finally, everyone arrived at the summoning island, which was also the training ground for the summoning unit. Poor students who experienced a condition worse than seasickness during such a flight, while Leo, meanwhile, was as if he had never flown. The guy walked next to the trees on which juicy fruits had already ripened, looking for a certain size. The moment Leo picked the fruit, a feather fell on him that didn't look like anything that belonged to a bird or even a griffin. Chen jumped off the bird and asked the guy what he found there that made him freeze in place, but he answered nothing. Flo, under Yura's cries that they had enough of idleness, approached the griffin and treated him to a fruit, which made the creature extremely happy with the treat. The professor said that right now the students would have a test for practical training, and that, as expected, complaints poured in from the newcomers since today was the first day. The same guy who didn't want to climb the griffin was now again unhappy that they had an introductory lesson and at the same time a test, which he completely did not understand. Yura did not stand on ceremony and immediately explained that their path was more difficult than that of other units and asked if anyone present did not know this fact. For those who are particularly slow-witted, the professor explained that for a summoner, normal control over mana is not enough. Yura added that in order to conclude a contract with a spirit, one needs a predisposition to such a special action. And in order to command those with whom a contract was concluded, a person must have the gift of taming. Thus, the professor led the students to the fact that this is precisely why the number of summoning heroes is an order of magnitude less than in the other two classes. At the same time, the woman reported that those summoners who have achieved a connection with the summoner can perform greater feats than other heroes. Finally, Yura asked if everyone who was here today had not come to become such heroes, to which she again heard loud cries that this was exactly how it was. Elsa Jorgen, who was a representative of the Georgian family of summoners from the north, came forward and asked directly what the essence of the test was. Yura also directly and briefly explained that the island where they are is called the Island of Summons. The name of the place spoke for itself, since there were plenty of summons here, and this creature is the main weapon of the summoner, and the test will accordingly test the student's abilities in taming. To make the picture even clearer, Yura explained that the test task was incredibly simple because it was necessary to tame a local summon and bring it, and after taming and concluding a contract, the creature would remain with the student. The students, their heels flashing, dozed off into the forest with such agility as if they were not trying to pass a test, but to collect their share of the gold. Considering that the only one who, as always, did not run after the crowd was Leo, the question immediately came to him, is this really the same headman? Elsa approached the guy like a sly fox, telling him about the sensational rumors about his victory over Duran, after which she asked if it turned out that he would also attend these classes. Chen was shocked by the way this girl spoke to Leo, but the guy standing next to her clearly had a grudge against the headman. Flo turned around brazenly and walked into the forest, and without looking back, he answered Elsa's question only by saying that the best should succeed in everything. The girl did not like this answer because she was used to the fact that they communicate with her in a completely different way, and mostly in the way she liked. But Yura was pleased that a picture was emerging where the guys who stayed and didn't run away would become key figures among the first years. Leo walked deep into the forest while many immediately found their summons, both large and small. And the dark horse went deeper and deeper into the forest, not paying attention to the whispers behind him about how he had gone too far, but someone was happy about it because if he failed, he would return to the nightly unit. When the noise and hubbub were left behind, Leo put his hand under his jacket to get something important for himself. In the guy's hands was the very feather that had fallen on the fruit and which he had kept silent about in front of Chen, because he himself did not yet know what this would mean for him. Leo concentrated his phoenix aura on the feather and fire began to blaze around it, which is why he went so far. The next moment, the guy watched as the feather burned, but at the same time sparks emanated from it in different directions. while an ordinary one would simply flare up and fall to the ground as ashes. And when the fire around Flo disappeared but a bright light appeared behind him, the young man was so surprised for the first time and froze in place. Meanwhile, Leo's parents went out into the mountains with a tent and had a wonderful time in the fresh air, except that Mrs. Reyna was still a little worried about her son. Mr. Dade reminded his beloved that today was only the first day of school and placed a plate of food on the table. Asking why she was so worried, Dade handed Reyna a mug of hot drink and she thought for a moment. It was not for nothing that Reyna had such an anxious premonition about her son, since at that very moment Leo was in the middle of the forest, engulfed in flames all around. And while the mother tried to calm herself down by saying that something like that could happen, her son at that time felt the furious heat of one of the three greatest, Phoenix Simmons. Leo continued to withstand temperatures incompatible with life, and the fire not only took shape, but also turned to him with the question of whether this was really Zerdinger's child and moreover, smelled of the flames of Reyna. Leo asked how the creature knew his mother, to which it questioningly repeated the word mother and said that it meant it was not mistaken in its premonitions. A real phoenix appeared in front of the guy and clarified that if Reyna really had a child, it would be approximately the same age as Leo is now, and the bird answered the guy's question that it knows Reyna. The creature made it clear to the young man that it not only knew the lady, but even owed her a great deal at the time they met. Phoenix introduced herself as Farina, and the guy stood more relaxed in front of one of the three mystical-level summons, greeting her in return. Leo gave his full name and asked Farina how she was connected to his mother and what debt she mentioned at the beginning of the conversation. Farina explained without hiding anything that Reyna saved the life of her summoner Ellen Lunda, which is why Flo was shocked to learn the name of the hero he had heard about. Phoenix decided to tell briefly about what happened and began with the fact that Ellen was clearing the dungeon in Seiren, having lost all her companions and her own life was in danger. At the most critical moment, Reyna appeared and saved Ellen from death and oblivion that would have overtaken her in the dungeon. The only happy ending to this story was on Ellen's side since Reyna lost her fiery aura in the process of being saved. When Farina finished the story, explaining that if it weren't for that incident, Reyna had every chance of becoming a hero, Leo looked down at the floor, filled with sympathy for his mother. Flo told Phoenix that his mother said that she never regretted what she did, to which Farina laughed, confirming his words since Reyna really was such a knight. Leo wanted to know how Farina ended up in Lumen, to which she replied that she couldn't say for sure, but at the same time asked a counter question about what the guy who was supposed to become a knight was doing on the island. Flo answered so directly that he was attending the class on conscription, which caused a rather vivid reaction from Phoenix. Farina saw at that moment what only she could see, and smiling said that a rather interesting situation had developed and their meeting was more like fate. Having become even brighter and more powerful, Phoenix told the young man that she would finally be able to fully repay her debt to his mother. Farina asked Leo to stretch out his hands and accept her gift, after which a small flame appeared on his palm. The majestic creature told the guy that he was now holding in his arms her child who had not even been born yet. The bird explained to Flo that one day he would become a great summoner, and then, as Farina hoped, would make a contract with the new Phoenix. Farina regretted that for now this was all she could give, and Leo asked if it was really impossible to sign a contract right now, which surprised her. Phoenix warned the boy that it was too early to sign a contract because even a chick's power would be so great that he could lose his life. Only after her words, Farina became convinced that she was wrong, because the guy was engulfed in flames, and this meant that it was too late to change anything. The bird sensed what Flo was about to do, so she nostalgically said that his determination to challenge the impossible reminded her of Reyna, and finally she wished him luck and flew away. Everything around Leo went dark, and in this impenetrable darkness there remained only him and his future summon. The guy took a risk and touched the fire, not expecting either good or bad results from his action. After touching, the small flame turned into a tornado of flame that surrounded Leo from all sides. Flo screamed in pain, realizing that he had practically nothing to breathe since there was only fire around him. But he understood that this was the nature of the Phoenix flame. The young man's hand turned black, but he knew that as a result of combustion, in order to study such a powerful flame, the birds faced such pain every day. Leo didn't even move away from the hearth, but more and more accepted that phoenixes live thanks to the regeneration of their eternally burning flesh. Surrounded by flames that only grew, the young man froze and closed his eyes, thinking that he accepted and shared pain with the creatures who were forced to experience it. Immediately after, Flo thought that he would not resist the elements, The egg with Farina's child appeared in his hand again. The egg cracked at the top, and Leo continued to hold it and remained level and just waited. The time of truth had come, and the phoenix child rose into the air in front of the guy, spinning a fiery funnel around itself. As it turned out, Farina had not disappeared anywhere, but had been watching Flo all this time, and after she saw that the egg had almost opened, she rhetorically asked with delight if it had really worked, to which he confidently replied, wiping the sweat from his face. Farina smiled and with admiration admitted out loud that Leo Flo was a true genius. The bird acquired the human form of a fiery woman and added that the guy would have no equal in this world. Farina congratulated the young man on successfully concluding the contract and holding her child in her arms, introduced her as Fiora. Leo stood in a stupor, not knowing what to be more surprised about. The fact that in front of him was an incredibly beautiful woman and not a bird, or the fact that Phoenix did not look like a phoenix, but looked more like a red chicken. Farina handed Fiora to the young man, saying that she was entrusting him with her child, after which the baby made a funny sound, and Flo was only convinced that the little one really did look like chicken, but of course all this was in his thoughts. The sun was already at its zenith, so the wyvern kindly raised its wing to shelter its owner from the sun while she looked at the summoned students, among whom there was even a wombat, which she found very cute. Yura asked Carlo what their time was, and he said that there were 5 minutes left until the end of the test. Carlo looked at the list and calculated that there were only 4 left, and Yura looked thoughtfully into the forest, realizing that the most delicious was left for dessert. The teacher was not mistaken because the next moment a huge bear ran out of the forest, but the student was nowhere to be seen. Only when the animal stopped did a battered Chen peek out from behind it, wondering if the time was up yet, but Yura was impressed that the girl had tamed the water bear, so she didn't even say anything about the time. And then the show of who would do more, higher, and better began because a large shadow passed over Chen and her summon. The guy who, like Leo, was the last to go into the forest landed on the ground holding onto the paw of a shadow raven, which also surprised Yura, since even a representative of a famous family cannot always tame one. The student said that he had not yet signed a contract, but the professor replied that even such an indicator as simply bringing such a creature was already more than good. Elsa also did not lag behind, arriving riding on a gigantic snake that looked just like her. The girl reported from above that she went further and made a contract with this creature because there were no such creatures in their family yet, to which Yura praised such a find in the form of a gorgon snake. Carlo shouted that time was up and that the last student was just pulling up as he came out of the forest. Everyone immediately stared at Leo, expecting him to snatch something out of the ordinary or nothing at all, but he calmly walked up to everyone. Fiora sat on the guy's head, making her cute and funny sounds like a chick. All the same, bullies who sometimes praise Leo and then throw mud at him this time also laughed at him and his mediocrity, thinking that maybe he would finally give in here at least, and all just because they were stupid and did not understand who he had tamed. But Professor Yura was shocked by how much the guy outdid everyone, even though he had the tiniest summon on his head of all the students. Yura couldn't think of anything else to say except Mother of God, realizing that a baby phoenix was sitting on the young man's head. Upon returning to the academy, Leo stood in the hallway, adjusting his tie as he was asked to come to the professor's office. The young man knocked on the door and then heard Yura's voice asking him to come in. The professor stood leaning on the table reading papers about today's test, and besides them, there was a bunch of other different materials on the table. Leo reminded the teacher that he had been told that she had been looking for him, and Yura had asked him to come in and sit down in the chair. Yura confessed to the guy that today, for the first time in her life, she saw a phoenix chick while he was sitting down in the chair. The professor appeared next to Leo so close that he even felt a little uneasy, and she continued to explain that she didn't even think that phoenixes lived on the island of summoning. Yura, meanwhile, was getting closer and closer to Flo, speaking in bewilderment about how this was an unprecedented case in the history of the academy for a newcomer to immediately sign a contract with Phoenix. Poor Leo, even when engulfed in flames by the majestic firebird, was not as nervous as he was now in such a close audience with the professor, which is why he pressed his whole body into the chair. Yura, holding onto the arms of the chair and leaning over, only told the guy that she seemed to know who he really was. Flo felt himself starting to feel sick. The light began to dim before his eyes and not a single word could escape his lips. The professor hugged the guy so much that she almost fell to the floor along with him in the chair, shouting what a genius Leo was at summoning. Returning the chair with the young man to its normal position, Yura said that it would be great to reward him for such an achievement, But at the same time, she clarified that for now it would be better to keep a secret that the guy had signed a contract with Phoenix. Flo was still sitting silently and recovering from the shock while Yura was telling him that if he revealed such news now, there would be a stir in the academy. Yura put her hand on Leo's shoulder and said that she had an important request for him after the introductory classes were over. The professor asked the young man to choose a summoning class as his main direction because she believes that he is born to become the greatest summoning hero that everyone will remember for a very long time, and Leo thought that he had already heard something similar from Farina. The next day came at the Lumen Academy when the introductory classes were still taking place, and this time it was possible to try something new again. Chloe walked down the corridor yawning quite loudly because she thought she was walking alone and couldn't do anything about such terrible fatigue. The girl had to cover her mouth very quickly when she heard someone behind her make a joking remark about how she could tear her cheeks like that. Next to Leo walked Carl, who made a remark, emphasizing that Chloe looked tired, to which she threw out a weighty argument for reading a magic book until late. Flo reached into his pants pocket to give something to a classmate and asked again, just in case, if she was Chloe Miller. The guy handed Chloe her ID, which he had been carefully keeping all this time, and finally had the opportunity to return it. Leo explained that he noticed the document at the moment of their collision on the street, but at that moment, there was no opportunity to look for it because he had arranged a meeting with Celia. Chloe gasped when she remembered that incident and now realized that she had run into the head of the first years himself, and after that she thanked him. The three guys sat down at one table and Carl ironically asked Leo not to say that he was going to the magic class, to which he again explained that he wanted to try everything possible while the introduction was going on. Carl tried to tell only Flo that the Ice Girl was going to become the first in the magic division, and it was unclear why, but he also clarified that he was talking about Chloe Miller, if anything. And the girl sitting literally next to them was not deaf and not stupid. So she heard the idiot who had previously joked about her yawning too much, whispering about her. Carl noticed Chloe's cold gaze on him, both literally and figuratively, so he got up from the table and blurted out something like, "There was a cold breeze," and was about to leave. The jester just started to say that it would be better to go somewhere far away, but it was too late and an ice barrier appeared right in front of his face. Almost losing his jaw from shock, Carl raised his head up and saw that his path was blocked by a block of ice 2 meters high, if not more. Now Chloe stood up from the table and told Carl that he was actually sitting in front with her. Leo was amused by how Chloe quickly decided to figure out how Carl was very interested in magic and offered her help. Flo froze when he heard a girl's voice calling him, and while he was turning in that direction, he tried to figure out who it could be. The young man turned around and saw his sister and brother Revelin waving at him, who, as it turned out, had also come to class. Leo was surprised by the guys, but there was no time to talk because at that moment, the door opened and the professor entered the classroom with the words, "I'm glad to welcome everyone to the magic lesson." While the teacher walked by and explained that he would be teaching them magic for the next year, the students were swooning over how handsome he was. The professor introduced himself to everyone as Glenn Holmes, although in appearance, he looked more like a young vampire in a cloak. Mr. Glenn placed his hand on the stack of papers and informed the students that this material would be needed before the start of today's classes. The professor clicked his finger and made the papers scatter onto each student's desk, explaining that it was a short written test. Leo picked up the piece of paper and began to look at the assignments, while again hearing the indignation of some of his classmates about the test being on the very first day. But Mr. Glenn confirmed that yes, he does do a test on the first day of acquaintance in order to select those students who meet his standards. An hourglass appeared above the professor's hand, and he clarified that the assignments that were currently lying on the table should be cracked by student Lumen like nuts. The last thing Mr. Glenn said was that after finishing the work, he would hand it over to his assistant Anna, who waved her hand at the guys so that they could get their bearings. Leo felt goosebumps run down his spine as he realized that the magic from his past life did not fit with current magical trends, and he immediately realized that the formula was confusing. In the auditorium, the sound of pens scraping across paper and sand pouring out of a watch could be clearly heard in the silence. A couple of students who had already handed in their work began to discuss the fact that some of the assignments were easier than expected, but when it came to the last question, it turned out that the guy had not handed it in. At the same time, Leo felt his head was boiling, and he could no longer understand anything, so he decided to let it be as it would be, since he had only completed one task. The young man was shaking all over, and his legs were giving way, So he hurried to hand in his work, thinking that he should have studied modern magical theory better before attending this class. Leo, without waiting for the test results, left the classroom squeezed like a lemon and with thoughts that now he would have to study magic on his own. The test time passed while Flo walked and discussed how over the last 100 years, magic has changed a lot in terms of evolution. And if earlier, it required perfect understanding, now it is used with knowledge of the principles of activation. Already at that moment, Leo understood that the evolution of magic had lowered the level of current magicians, and in the audience, there was another snap of fingers, and the papers, only with marks, flew back to their owners' desks. The students who were shocked by how handsome the professor was were now sitting in shock by how their admissions test results were for the worse. The professor raised his hand not to announce the results but to show everyone present something important. In Mr. Glenn's hand, it was as if a new star had appeared, from which many symbols eventually began to diverge. And that same little spark appeared above the professor, launching even more stars and even galaxies away from itself. The students seemed to have found themselves in a planetarium and watched the formulas and constellations with their mouths open, while the professor told them that in front of them was his essence of magic and that he had created it himself from beginning to end. Mr. Glenn informed everyone that he wanted to help students create their own magic. Closing his palm, the professor also closed his magical world, explaining that it was precisely because creating the essence of magic is hard work and not tricks that he conducted the test. Now that the papers were done, Mr. Glenn made it clear that the 49 questions were based on simple memorization, and each was worth 1 point, but only one question on the true essence was worth 51 points. Chelsea looked at her test, and after hearing what the professor had said, she wasn't surprised that she couldn't answer the main question. The girl noticed that Leo gave up early and just left, but she was upset not because of this, but more because she would have liked to go to classes with him. The assistant ran up to Mr. Glenn to tell him some important news about the test. The professor was terribly surprised when he heard that there was one student who was able to answer that very 50th question about the essence. Mr. Glenn scared Anna because after her words he laughed very loudly, not hiding how happy he was with such news. The mentor immediately began asking which of the students was the first in history to score the highest on the test, but everyone sat there perplexed. Holmes was so delighted that he looked around with hungry eyes among the students, asking the one who had passed the test to stand up. But then Anna decided to timidly clarify that this was not the highest score. Glenn still said that a few missed answers were nothing compared to passing the main question, and that it was neither good nor bad. But Anna again quietly said that it was not even about that. The professor seemed to have had an emotional roller coaster day today, as he was thrown by the information that this student only gave the correct answer to the last question. Mr. Holmes asked what kind of craftsman he was, and Anna showed him a photo of Leo Flo. The professor turned to the audience and asked student Leo Flo to stand up, but instead, a quiet hum of discussion spread through the class, and Carl and Chloe also looked at each other, not understanding where their friend had gone. Chelsea hesitantly informed the professor that student Leo had left immediately after taking the test and that there was indeed a piece of paper lying on his desk. Mr. Glenn approached the absent student's desk and saw the very same mark on the paper indicating that only the 51st question had been submitted. Meanwhile, Leo was sitting with Celia over a delicious dessert, and she was already laughing at how this fool left only because he could only answer one question. Celia was also enjoying a huge portion of ice cream with fruit, while mentioning that Flo already had a chicken from the summoning classes and now only one answer on the magic test, and concluded that he was moving in the wrong direction. The girl advised her friend to focus on fencing if he was aiming more for the knightly division, to which Leo decided to joke and asked if she really wanted to train together, but Celia couldn't finish. The poor girl stared at the tall gentleman in the black cloak behind her, who had concluded from the boys' conversation that the guy preferred knightly affairs, and when Flo turned around he heard that he had decided to laugh at the magic lessons. The professor asked why the student left immediately after taking the test, and whether it was because it seemed so easy that he didn't even want to wait for the results. Leo respectfully stood in front of Mr. Glenn and explained that it was a misunderstanding because he was sure that he had failed the test, which surprised him very much. Holmes's state of shock was growing, and now he also heard from the guy that all the questions except the last one were quite difficult for him, so he could only answer it. The professor didn't even really know what to answer, and Leo continued to explain that he studied magic on his own by reading outdated books, so such advanced questions left him stumped. When Holmes realized who was in front of him, He emotionally simply lifted the young man in his arms in front of him, which even shocked Celia. Having lowered Leo to the ground, the professor saw in his face a lot of questions. At least what the hell was going on now? But all that Mr. Glenn said was a request to follow him, which after such a sharp rise to the top was difficult to do and trust this strange man. Leo didn't have to put in much effort because Holmes grabbed him by the clothes and drummed him along to speed up the process. Celia remained sitting at the table thinking about how eccentric this teacher of magical theory was, and Anna was already running up to her from behind. The assistant, out of breath, asked Miss Celia if she had seen Professor Glenn and if he had done anything wrong, to which the girl said that he had indeed been there just a second ago. The student also added that Mr. Holmes grabbed Leo Flo by the collar of his jacket and dragged him away, which left Anna in shock. Anna also lost her temper after such news and ran after Glenn, mentally cursing him for not understanding what this crazy guy had in mind. And Holmes simply wiped the board and wrote a task for Leo on it and asked him to solve it right now. Flo calmly walked up to the board and began to complete the task, while the professor thought that if the guy really hadn't solved the last question by pure luck, then that meant he had his own idea of the magic system in his head. Holmes seemed to be in a fever, so he eagerly awaited the guy's answer and watched him mentally asking him to show his true potential. Leo turned to the teacher and said that he had already solved the problem given to him, which the teacher didn't even understand at first. The professor looked at the board and then at the student and could not understand whether he had really solved it in his head, since there was not one problem but several, to which Leo indifferently replied that yes, something like what the teacher had said. Mr. Glenn couldn't believe his luck, just like all the other teachers who saw the boy's potential during classes, and on the very first day. Arvy was leisurely walking along the corridor of the academy, minding his own business and lost in his thoughts. But suddenly, like a bolt from the blue, Holmes rushed towards the professor as if he were an armored train that could not be stopped. Glenn rushed to thank Mr. Arvy for finding such an amazing student and bringing him to Lumen. Only Arvy, looking at this approaching murderous machine of happiness, already understood that things were bad. Arvy instantly turned in the opposite direction from Holmes, but did not have time to leave because he fell at the professor's feet with words of gratitude. Not wanting to tolerate such hysteria, Arvy lifted Glenn into the air, explaining that he had already become a victim of such antics of the professor more than once. But this time he was especially carried away. Holmes seemed to not care that he was hanging in the air and disgracing himself in front of another teacher, because he admitted that Leo Flo was a brilliant magician, the very one that Arvy recommended for prefect. Arvy understood who they were talking about, but was perplexed by what kind of magic was being talked about if the guy was originally going to be a knight. Glenn's face changed dramatically, and he said that there was no chivalry, and Leo had to become a magician at any cost, because he couldn't allow such a mind to atrophy while he was waving a metal stick. Anna ran up just at the moment when Arvy not only lowered Holmes to the ground, but took away his strength, and he fell down. The assistant managed to catch the professor at the last moment, who, even while falling, managed to complain that giving such a young genius into the care of the knights was an insult to magic, to which Arvy briefly replied, "Take him." Mr. Glenn was glad to see Anna and immediately thanked her for saving him, remaining satisfied that the boy would be his. Anna also pretended to be glad to see the teacher, but she was already shaking from fatigue and anger, so she gently asked Mr. Holmes to return to class, and she thought that someday she would finish off this idiot. Unexpectedly, someone adequate was finally walking behind Arvy, and this time it was that very genius Leo. All that happened at that moment when Flo and Arvy crossed paths was again a silent exchange of glances, like all the previous times. The guy remained standing in place while the professor walked on, thinking that these magicians, as always, were a little out of this world. After a week, when the trial lessons ended, Leo was still in no hurry as before, but enjoyed reading a book on the roof of the academy. The young man slammed shut the book about Kyle, the hero of the source, which decided the most important question, whether he was a fraud. Flo sat on the edge of the roof, looking at the academy's territory from a bird's-eye view, and kept thinking about his most important mission within the walls of the educational institution. At this time, a crowd of people rushed along the corridor, heading to a specific place to resolve an important issue. Director Callion was forced to tear himself away from his paperwork because his office was broken into without even knocking. At the door stood professors who looked more like overexcited students who couldn't stop themselves from telling the news and shouted that it was something incredible. Ein handed the director a paper on which was Leo Flo's statement that he wanted to try the entire division because of his desire to be everywhere. The next moment, an argument arose about Leo having to study in the department that each professor represented, and if the young man were here now, he would be torn to pieces. Mr. Kalyan laughed at the situation, drawing a parallel with the fact that the incident reminded him of that same fictitious hero. Finally, the teachers stopped arguing and bickering because they understood who they were talking about. The director confirmed the professor's guesses that he really meant the fifth-grade hero or the hero of the source. Mr. Kalyan looked out the window and called out the name Kyle, informing everyone that he was the only master of all three types. The weather was wonderful, so the students were able to spend more time outdoors, particularly on the training ground. Celia was both lucky and unlucky with her cousin because on the one hand she became more resilient, and now Chelsea couldn't keep up with her. But on the other hand, if you remember that she started out the same way as Chelsea, that was a minus. Leo sat under a tree listening to Carl's surprise that the girls trained even on weekends. But Flo explained to his friend that Chelsea herself asked to train her. But Carl still didn't understand why the girls were just running and where their weapons for training were then. Leo again made it clear to Carl that there are things more important than weapons. But instead of him, Celia answered, who just ran up and said that this important thing is endurance. Chelsea also picked up on the fact that endurance was the most important aspect of a battle mage and immediately motioned for Carl to move over, waving her hand. Princess Revelyn sat down so that she was next to Leo, but at the same time she pushed Carl with her butt while Flo was giving water to Celia. Chelsea said that she enjoyed running on her day off because she really missed it, but she also mentioned that she would have gone for a run with Leo too. Flo asked Chelsea again if she would really run with him, to which Celia had a violent reaction, as she spat out water from the guy's reaction, and Revelyn did not understand what was wrong with the girl. Noticing what happened to Celia, Leo smiled sarcastically and said that he had planned to run with her anyway, so he asked the girl to do it properly, to which she angrily said that she would not run with him. Carl asked again what was going on between Leo and Celia and why they were so close, because at first he thought that the guys were dating. Celia once and for all shed light on the fact that Leo is actually her cousin, since he is her aunt's son. At that moment, both Carl and Chelsea were in shock because they found out that Leo was Zerdinger, but Celia corrected them that this was not entirely true due to some family circumstances, but it was not so important. Flo stood up and told Celia to do what she had planned, which Chelsea was happy about, but her cousin was not so happy about. Carl in turn decided to also say that in that case, he would go for a weekend walk instead of all this running around. Celia tearfully asked her friend to take her for a walk with him, but Flo was already dragging her by the scruff of the neck to go jogging. Carl smiled, asking where the normal nobles in his circle were with whom he could walk and have a leisurely conversation. On the day of class assignments, Lumen Academy was buzzing like a beehive as all the students were eagerly discussing who had gotten where and who they would now study with. Leo walked up to the door of Class 1-5 and pushed it open without any expectations or worries about who he would be studying with. The first person Flo saw was Carl, or rather, his friend saw Leo and called him over to immediately discuss the fact that they would still be together during training. Leo asked Carl if he knew that he would already be in this class, to which the guy confidently said that there was nothing that he didn't already know. Flo also noticed that Chelsea was there too, but only physically, because the poor thing couldn't think of anything after training, but she still said hello. Carl, in his usual manner, asked what Leo had been doing with the poor girl all weekend, to which he simply replied that he had been brushing up on the basics, and Chelsea, in a barely alive voice, said that she would never do such a thing again. The bullies appeared again, who only wanted to make fun of the newcomers, so they immediately asked if this was the famous suffering Class 1-5, and then asked how many of them would remain after the first semester. When the idiots blurted out something about condolences to the younger students, they heard a voice behind them who told the guys that they both could use some sympathy right now. The bullies turned in the direction from which someone had spoken to them and were already mentally praying to stay alive. The one the idiots feared most asked again if he wasn't right that the guys would need empathy if they continued to be so self-confident. To be on the safe side, the unfortunate students decided that it would be better to remain silent altogether. But it was already too late, and their class teacher, Harrod Edmund, said the word bridge. The students immediately carried out the will of Mr. Edmund and made a bridge with their bodies, as he said, after which the leader headed towards them. Harrod sat comfortably on 2 human bridges and was even able to cross his legs, and he greeted his class with words about how glad he was to meet the worthless scum. The professor also added that right in front of him now sits a class of losers who scored the least points among the newcomers, and in that case he clarified that most likely the students had already heard about him and his nickname Tear Squeezer. After Herod asked if anyone knew why he was appointed as the class teacher for classes 1-5, no one could give a clear answer. Carl decided to take a chance and replied that perhaps the reason was to improve their academic performance if they were such losers. The class teacher read the boy as if he were reading a book, saying that Carl Thomas was a typical representative of losers, which is why the poor guy couldn't even say anything in response. Herod tried again to find out if none of the scum class understood what the duty of a student of the Lumen Academy was, but now Chelsea took a risk, suggesting that they should conquer the world of heroes through practical missions. Finally, Mr. Tear Squeezer agreed with the student, but immediately clarified that he saw here only the faces of those who would die as soon as they stepped outside the academy, so he said out loud that it would be better to immediately expel those who were dragging the class down. This is how the professor explained the reason why he took over class 1-5, and Herod still hasn't gotten off the bridge of 2 students. Mr. Edmund was still talking about the root of his nickname, but his gaze was already fixed on the student who was different from the majority. The class teacher met Leo's gaze, and the boy undoubtedly caught his attention. The first thing that Harry thought when he looked at Flo was that this particular guy might be able to survive. Before the students had time to recover from the shock of who they would be spending time with every day, this strict man commanded them to change into their training uniforms and go to the training ground. At the training ground, the boys were treated to nothing less than a pastime based on combat testing. The students lined up to await further instructions from Mr. Edmund, but he was a little busy with his own affairs. Having settled himself very comfortably in a chair under an umbrella and with a drink in his hand, the leader explained that the students' lesson begins with eradicating illusions about the Lumen Academy. Herod immediately began to break the illusory glasses by saying that the students should stop being sure that they can save someone in that world where lives come and go almost at the snap of a finger. At that moment, Nella Carvin from the night unit with the healing attribute responded in a very timid and quiet voice, wondering if they, as comrades, shouldn't protect each other. The professor cut off that this was complete nonsense, and that in this cruel world you can only rely on yourself, and even if you think about saving someone, you first need to understand whether you have enough strength inside. So he asked the student why she thought she could help someone. Instead of Nella, another student volunteered with confidence in her voice, declaring that she could definitely handle it and was ready to show what she was capable of. The leader let out a sarcastic laugh and asked the girl to create a fireball to test her abilities. Elena Loudon of the Night and Magic Division easily accomplished the task. Edmund wasn't particularly impressed, asking sarcastically if that was all, and then adding that such a ball could only kill an ant, but such criticism only egged Elaine on, and she said that it wouldn't be a problem to invest a little more mana. The classmates had to move away when the girl already had 2 fireballs in her hands, now asking the leader what he would say. Having reacted poorly to the fact that Elaine could not only support 2 balls but also double them, Herod nevertheless admitted that he was impressed. But this cunning devil would not be himself if he did not offer the student to hit the little girl with his spell and pointed his finger at the ball. A small sylph emerged from the ball and looked so cute that it was impossible to take your eyes off it. The creature flew straight to Elaine, and she even reduced her strength. She was so confused by such a tiny thing. Sylph even became even more cute on purpose and touched the girl's nose, quietly laughing. But Elaine quickly restrained herself, remembering about testing her powers, so the first reaction that arose was anger and not affection. The student threw ball after ball, and the sylph dodged so skillfully that it looked more like a dance. When the creature appeared near the owner, he concluded that there was no point in strength if it could not hit the target, and asked now that the students realized that they lacked efficiency in using skills. The guys were broken after such words, and Herod reminded them that everyone needs to hone their skills in order to surpass themselves, because even the director said this at the first meeting. Smiling sarcastically, Mr. Edmund said that until the students caught his sylph, the lesson would not be completed, and asked the children to try, sarcastically, calling them Lumen's Hope. Leo also took note that the professor's manner of speech, although rude, was in fact right about the skills. Flo thought that he should also join in the work, because there is no limit to perfection, so he ran after the sylph. Harry shouted at the guy's back, "Leo, Flo," thinking that this would either help him or make things worse. The professor looked at the young man's back, wondering whether Leo was the same windbag as the fictitious hero Kyle or not. Sylph flew among the students and, laughing maliciously, eluded them with the ease of a dance, while the guys made titanic efforts to catch her. Leo decided to try using his phoenix step again, like in the competition with Duran, and was already prepared for the forced march. Flying like a comet across the entire training ground, The young man undoubtedly attracted attention to himself, as the wind rose like a hurricane. Approaching the goal, Leo and Herod thought that maybe he was the first real all-rounder in 3 divisions. Chelsea and Carl, meanwhile, were already exhausted from running after this little thing with wings and still hadn't figured out how to catch it. Flo ran forward without stopping and focused as much as possible on completing the task. Step by step, the guy approached the sylph while remaining invisible to her, which was to his advantage. While the creature was happily frolicking and fluttering, Leo had only 1 jump left to complete the task. The young man had very little time left to catch the sylph, and the hand was already almost there. But the little ones flew away right from under Flo's nose, not giving him any hope, since he is the same as the other students for her. Only Leo deliberately pretended that he missed, and the next moment, while the sylph was distracted, he began to attract her with his aura, which now made it difficult for the creature to resist. But it turned out in the end that the thief stole the club from the thief because now, right in front of the sylph's nose, Duran, whom Leo did not expect to see at all, snatched from him. Both guys went down to the training ground, but neither of them started a fight or swearing, but simply watched each other. Duran demonstratively turned to Leo with the sylph in his hands in order to show that he was still better and still hadn't calmed down about their competition for the place of the headman. From the side, a single round of applause was heard from a stately man in white gloves and with long snow-white hair. Their class teacher, Seijin, who was in charge of Class 1, won and was considered second in terms of the effectiveness of graduates, approached Duran and told the students from Class 1-5 that they had a lot to learn from the first one. But Herod didn't jump up and start foaming at the mouth to prove something, but instead, while sipping his drink, he just asked if maybe Seijin could teach them instead of him. The class teacher, who was first in assessing the effectiveness of graduates, looked at Seijin with an unperturbed look. Seijin was irritated that he hadn't managed to touch a nerve with his colleague's behavior, considering how indifferent he was to everything. But Carl responded to the leaders by asking the heir whether there would really be a fight between the pillars of the academy now, and when Leo asked what other pillars were, the guy explained that those 2 had been working for the good of the academy for 20 years. Carl also added that as far as he knows, Professors Ainura and Glenn value those 2 very much, and at that moment Nella admired her classmate's knowledge, wondering where he knew everything from. Carl was embarrassed that someone finally paid attention to him, so blushing and giggling, he said that he was an expert in such matters, to which Chelsea almost threw up. Seijin, standing in front of Herod, laughed at him, and ironically stated that he did not understand what he was thinking when he took on the class of losers. Seijin had a ball in his hand, and with this he wanted to show that the answer to the question of why Herod is such a loser will soon become clear. The cocky head of Class 1 asked Herod for a competition between their classes. Professor Edmund only reacted when he heard from Seijin about the proposal of the ancient sporting competition with the Buster Ball. Harry even groaned as he rose from his chair, telling his colleague and competitor directly that he was a genius. Grabbing Seijin's hand, the leader of the losers agreed that there was nothing better than a direct confrontation, but the professor warned that, in fact, Class 1 would win. Mr. Edmund plopped back down into his chair, saying that he didn't care who won or lost, as long as the lesson continued without his involvement. While Seijin was gritting his teeth because he couldn't understand how he could lose in grades to such an idiot, behind his back, the students noticed that the professor looked pathetic. Seijin turned around and, angry and offended, went to his class, which Duran did while Herod called his slackers to him. Mr. Edmund told the students that he was giving them a rare opportunity to practice their skills in a buster match with a Class 1. Leaning forward, the leader took on a serious look and warned the students that if they lost, they would all be expelled. This statement shocked everyone who was not confident in their abilities, and all that was left was to hope that it would work as motivation for the students. The fair-haired young man asked directly whether the headmaster was seriously planning to expel them in the first lesson, since the risk was high due to the fact that there were 3 top students in Class 1. But Herod didn't care, and taking a comfortable position in his chair, he said that it was no longer his problem, and that the students needed to figure it out on their own. Mr. Edmund's brave speech was not over, and he decided to add another important thing to do so that the children could see the other side of the coin. The professor assured his losers that they really had nothing to worry about because they had an ace up their sleeve. The trump card was the head of the course, Leo, who will lead the team at the match. The manager made eye contact with Flo, telling him to assemble a team of 6 people with whom he would play busters, and at that moment, Leo realized that Herod was testing him. When everyone turned to the guy, placing their hopes on him, He realized that the professor was testing him not because he disliked him. Leo knew the reason was that in Lumen, many students lose their spirit already in the first week, which is not surprising, and the professor wants him to give confidence to the weak kids from Class 1, 5 confidence. Professor Sadian was busy creating all the conditions for the historical game with the help of his staff. Flo understood his mission, which was to make a breakthrough in the Buster match and thereby raise the spirit of the class. Leo immediately noticed that he would be playing not only against Duran, but also against Celia, but he was calm, unlike Carl and Chelsea. The young man turned to the guys, wondering why they were so downcast, and Chelsea explained that given that Leo was from the provinces, he clearly hadn't heard of Busters and briefly explained that it was a combat sport that had already become a tradition at the academy. When Flo asked if this was not a simple ball game, Carl took it upon himself to explain that this was a terribly dangerous ball game. Chelsea heard someone calling her from the side and asking why she was so scared, to which she immediately responded and turned around. As it turned out, Celia was provocatively asking Chelsea if she had resigned herself to the inevitable defeat. The girl was shocked by such impudence, and in the case of fight or flight, Chelsea decided to run for her own protection, but in the form of words. So she shouted to Celia that she would not allow herself to lose to Zerdinger. Leo hugged his friends, sincerely assuring his cousin not to be afraid for them, because they were not going to lose. Now Celia had an irritated grimace. She couldn't believe that the guy was there and threatened to show him the results of her training. Chloe wasn't very talkative, but inside she promised herself that she wouldn't lose to Leo Flo this time. While Harrod was snoring sweetly, Sayan asked the participants of each class to come out into the arena so that their teams could be seen. Leo didn't try to persuade or inspire the guys, but simply asked who was going with him, and 2 guys from his class had already dropped out because they weren't so confident in their abilities, so they remained standing aside. But Chelsea came out warming up her hands with a great desire to put the upstarts in their place, and Elena was also ready to direct all her anger towards victory since they were threatened with expulsion. They needed to show the professor what they were made of. Not as confidently as the girls, but still, Nella came out, along with the same fair-haired classmate whom Leo had not yet met. Flo didn't forget about Carl either, so no matter how he hid, he reminded the clown that he was actually playing too, but when he asked why, he wasn't given an answer. Leo stepped forward and informed Professor Sejin that Class 5 was ready to play, although you couldn't tell from Carl, who was barely dragging behind. Sejin tossed the ball a couple of times to make sure it was okay before the game and was ready to call the start. The most exciting moment was when the professor, without a word, threw the ball into the air as a signal that the game had begun. There were students on Flo's team who were nervous, but knowing who their leaders were, they still followed him with complete trust. At the same time, the Class 1 team had only one factor that united them, and that was their grudge against Leo, and everyone, as one, wanted to prove to him that they were also worth something. The team leaders simultaneously flew towards the ball, repeating the same rivalry that had been at the beginning. This time the advantage was with Duran, who was driven more by revenge than by the spirit of play and competition. As they descended back onto the field, the participants heard Class 1, one making the first move, thereby paving the way for victory. Leo approached the situation wisely, and after learning the name of his participant, he asked Tide to explain the rules. Tide Margot, who had a summoning unit, explained that the rules are simpler than they seem and consist of filling the ball with aura and throwing it into the hoop without touching it with your hands or feet, and the first one to gain a 2-point advantage wins. Tide loudly warned Carl to get ready because Duran was moving towards him, and he had quite a dangerous mana. Carl might have been happy to get ready, but he understood that he was small fry compared to Duran, so he simply froze in place. Duran, without sparing either the ball or the participants, loaded it up so that the comet would have been a rest compared to him. Leo noticed that the ball was flying not so much towards the target as towards him, and not yet fully knowing all the rules, he did not really understand what to do. The guy knew one thing for sure, that if he didn't jump back, he would get a good hit from this charge ball, but he wasn't planning on leaving the game just yet. Poor Carl didn't even have time to blink before the ball bounced off the ground and went straight into the hoop, and he remained standing motionless. Upon landing, Flo turned around to make sure that Duran had actually hit the target, and this was confirmed to him by the cheering fans. The boys from Class 5 stood there dejected, already knowing what awaited them at the end of the game, namely, returning home. Tide also concluded that Professor Harrod would most likely actually expel them all to hell and thus make himself feel better. But Leo distracted the young man from such bitter thoughts with the question of how he could get another point. Tide said that there are three ways, the first of which is if the ball flies out of the line during the opponent's throw, and the second is if you intercept the flying ball. The third way didn't work out because Nella shouted, "Watch out," because the game didn't stop while the boys were discussing the rules. The guys immediately turned around, realizing that now someone from their team would most likely get hurt. And indeed, the ball charged with aura hit Elaine, who so wanted to beat up her opponents. It turned out that Celia had gotten into Elena while wondering what the guys were whispering about instead of concentrating on the match. Tide immediately picked up Elaine to wait until she was taken from the field and to stay close the entire time. The young man explained that it was impossible to personally hit a player or block him, which was the third way to earn a point, in this case, to disable a player with the ball. Leo bent down to pick up the ball, thanking Tide for the explanation, and realized that now there would be no more bald spots anywhere. Flo warned that now it was his turn to earn points for the team that would lead them to victory. The scoreboard showed Elaine's name in red as she was eliminated, and the professors continued to watch the match. Sejin was silent because he had a lot to say, at least that the team of players with a fire attribute of high destructiveness has the greatest potential in Busters. And in the Class 1 team was Celia Zerdinger, whose flame is the most powerful among the famous families. Sejin nevertheless decided to mention to Herod, who was yawning, that he had agreed to the match, even though he saw that Celia Zerdinger was in Class 1, and now it was unclear what the professor was counting on because it would be incredibly difficult for his team to win. How Edmund irritated Sejin, and after his yawn he asked if he had really forgotten how to talk like a human. Herod looked at his old friend and asked him if he remembered his first student, the very child who was from the Zerdinger house. Sejin immediately replied that it was difficult to forget a student like Empress Bastera, but he did not understand what this was all about. But Herod quickly made it clear that in Class 5, the son of the very same empress who was once taught by Sejin was now fighting for victory. The professor did not answer, but it was already loud enough to understand the leader's excitement. The boys from Leo's class stood there, as if they had been thrown into the water, having accepted that they were doomed to failure, and had even lost faith that they were unworthy of being students at Lumen. As soon as one of the students thought that everything would end so quickly, a bright flame appeared on the field. Celia was pleased with the way her cousin looked and happily asked if he had finally collected his thoughts. Leo stood with the ball in his hands and was surrounded on all sides by the Phoenix aura, which he was going to take full advantage of. Celia knew what the guy was capable of, so when she saw him swinging, she shouted to her team that he was coming, so they needed to be careful. The ball flew straight into the opponent's ring, spinning a fiery trail behind it, but Flo did not stand still, but also ran forward, knowing that the ball would be blocked. The ball crashed into a block of ice that Chloe had constructed like a block, finally having the opportunity to get even. There was a hole in the ice from the ball, and the field fell silent because no one knew whether a goal had been scored or not. Chloe sat on the ground proud of her work and turned to Leo with the words that while she was in goal, he would not score a goal for him, but the guy finished the word to score for her. The poor girl froze in horror when she heard Flo's voice next to her, and he asked again if he had said what the girl wanted to say. Leo jumped up to the very top of the block where the ball was indeed stuck and pointed his hand at it. The young man hit the ball with such force that it passed through the boulder without any problems and landed right in the opponent's basket, while Chloe remained sitting on the ground. Sejin also lost his jaw from such a sight, realizing that the guy's sense of smell in battle is at an incredible level. Herod was pleased with absolutely everything, and especially with the expression on Sejin's face, who finally understood that he had not made a mistake in his choice of class. The crowd was now going wild, chanting Leo Flo's name and rooting for Class 5 to win the match. Sejin smiled, saying that it was now clear to him that a real game had finally begun between worthy opponents. The game really got hotter and gained momentum when Leo started playing at his full strength, after which the others caught up because even Carl was able to block. Chelsea unleashed their wind aura, and Tide unfortunately took a hit from Durant, so Class 1 took the lead again. Leo decided to act on the principle of an eye for an eye, so he knocked out one player from the Class 1 team, and Chloe also did not stop after that block of ice and continued the fight. The ball was back in Durant's hands, and this time he wasn't going to lose to Flo, so he loaded the ball up enough to clear any obstacle. Carl watched as the ball not only charged again but also twisted, approached him, but this time there was no fear. The ball was rapidly approaching the hoop like a sparkling snake, and intercepting it could have cost Carl dearly. But the jester would not be himself if he did not take such a risk and did not stop the ball so that the team had a chance to win. Not only did the guy use his mana to free the ball, he also received an electric shock that all the players on his team noticed. Carl was pleased with himself, believing that it was not in vain that he stopped the ball, since he felt that his mana was running out anyway. Mentally telling Leo that victory was his, the young man threw the ball to his friend on the field, which was already smoking from the game. Elena praised Carl for what he had done, and together with Chelsea, helped her friend leave the field while Leo was already ready to finish the game. The team's score was tied, and all that was left was to score the decisive goal. But Leo was left facing 3 top students on the opposing team. Flo picked up the ball, listening to the cries that he had already lost and that he had 3 of the best students against him, so it was better to give up. At the moment of truth, Chloe decided to show what she was still capable of, even though she lacked knowledge of magical theory. Having made many copies of herself, the girl warned that even without knowledge, she was not going to lose. Leo dropped down as if to a low start and watched as the opposing team became even bigger due to Chloe. As if on pins and needles, the boys had already activated their aura, and unable to bear such a long pause any longer, Celia shouted at Leo to attack. The guy, feeling the ground under his feet and sensing the force of friction, moved his position without resisting his cousin's call. In the blink of an eye, Flo seemed to evaporate or teleport because there was no trace of him left. All 3 opponents were stunned by how fast their opponent alone was, feeling their stomachs grow heavy with fear. Flo made it so that there were several of him too using an illusion, and each of them ran as fast as he did. Leo rushed past Celia like the wind, and she shouted to Chloe that the guy was going to score a goal, so she needed to stop him. Chloe kept her eyes on the approaching boy, thinking that it was too petty of him to use an illusion spell. The girl tried to figure out the real player, but 6 of them appeared in front of her, and she realized that now this was no longer a cheap trick, but real magic. Chloe, like last time, stood there dumbfounded as the real Leo ran past her. The girl's hair was disheveled by Flo's speed, and the magic that was applied to her impressed her so much that she fell to the ground. Chloe had already forgotten that she was standing at the gate and that she needed to block the ball, and instead she turned back, realizing that she had just seen the rare magic of the stars. Besides the fact that the student saw rare magic, she did not understand, looking at Leo, how a person could know and use the spell of the elves themselves. But Leo had already been declared the winner, as had his class, since the score was 11-10 in favor of those same losers. The guys who understood from the very beginning that they had no chance now stood hugging each other in tears, although they were already imagining how they were going home. Seijin didn't understand how his class of top students lost and stared at Harid, waiting for an explanation, to which he simply replied that it was probably motivation. The professor looked at the remaining 3 top students who felt the shame of defeat. But at the same time, the class teacher of Class 1, although upset, did not lose his head and understood that his support was now very important to the students. Jen approached Chloe and offered her hand, asking if she was very upset that she lost, but she remained silent. Helping the student get up, the professor explained that regardless of the result, one must bow to the opponent or at least shake his hand. Chloe didn't expect Mr. Sajin to praise her and the others for doing a great job trying to grab the victory for their class. The guys were really upset, but they were helped by the professor's support, which brought them back to a cheerful state. Sejin reminded the students that, for the sake of those who cheered for them and those who gave their all in the arena, the guys should stand with their heads held high. The students quickly stood up and were filled with pride that they had such a class teacher. At the same time, Sejin was horrified that Harrod called his students losers anyway and shouted at them to approach their opponents and finish everything properly. When the teams met on the field again, Sejin sincerely told both sides that they had worked hard. In the case of Class 1 and their performance in the game, the professor praised the boys for their excellent display of their talents. And Leo's Class 1-5 Sejin praised for their resilience and endurance, thanks to which they were able to reach the end and give it their all. Mr. Sejin informed everyone that absolutely every player used their abilities to overcome difficulties and get out of the situation. The professor also expressed his hope that the students would continue to work hard on themselves while continuing to compete with each other, after which he asked them to shake hands. Celia happily praised Chelsea for holding out longer than expected, to which her friend said that she was the one who wanted to say it, but she was as quick as a squid. Carl laughed and shook Duran's hand, reminding the prince that victory had nevertheless been on their side. But the young man instantly regretted what he said because he saw Duran's silent reaction to what he blurted out. Chloe stood with her head down and her gaze cast down, trying with all her might to hold back the tears that were trying to escape. The girl heard from the side that it was a cool game and saw a hand extended to her, but was unable to look up. Leo still held her hand, explaining that if the girl had a little more experience, she would definitely become an outstanding sorceress. The tears suddenly dried up in her eyes, and Chloe became stern and asked if the guy was laughing at her now after what he had already done. But Leo silently continued to hold her hand, not saying anything else, thereby making it clear to the girl that he said those words in all seriousness. Chloe thought for another split second before shaking his hand and stood silently with her head down again. And after the ice girl decided that one day she would definitely defeat Leo, Flo shook his hand, as if she had made a promise to herself. A month later, the classmates were sitting at a table in a cafe, and while Leo and Chelsea were calmly drinking their drinks, Carl, with his mouth full, was asking which club they would like to join. Flo replied that he was planning to open his own club, after which Carl, almost choking on his food, shouted whether he had heard everything correctly, to which Chelsea in turn shouted for the guy to observe table manners. Chelsea immediately said that if Leo really creates his own club, she will definitely join him, but Carl was more interested in what kind of club it will be. Flo said that this was a research society of heroes, and the guys unanimously repeated what was said only in the form of a question. Leo explained that he wanted to thoroughly investigate the truth about the hero Kyle, but Carl objected that not only was this a relic of the past, it was also a fake. The alchemist assured his friend that the club would be empty, to which Chelsea shouted that in that case, she would be the first to appear there, and she herself wondered if she would really be left alone with Leo. Suddenly, the students ran to the window shouting that someone had returned, and everyone enthusiastically joined in the shouts. Carl also jumped up from the table, saying only that it really was today, although it didn't give his friends anything. The guys also came up to the others to see whose appearance everyone had such a violent reaction to. As it turned out, it was the day when the fifth year was returning from the dungeon they had cleared, which is why everyone was so delighted with them. Fragments of the heroic protocol are scattered throughout the world, and when they appear from time to time, they form dungeons called hero dungeons. Now the younger students watched the senior classes of the academy as they cleared such dungeons, returning fragments of the heroic protocol, and such a journey could last from a week to a month. Leo remembered that his mother also completed exactly the same task and successfully returned to the academy. Chelsea excitedly said that it turns out that these are the best students of Lumen, and at that moment, Carl cleared his throat to tell about each of them. Carl introduced the tall, muscular guy with black hair as Lee Jamia from the east. The trio stood out from the general background, and the girl who was walking next to Lee was called Toria Yan, and she was from the south. And the last of the leading students was a pale guy in a hood, whose name was Yulta. Carl looked more closely at the crowd and said that he did not see the main highlight of the program, but when Leo asked again what he was talking about, someone touched him with a hand. In such cases, another person would have screamed or fought back, but Leo froze like a statue and was dragged further while he distantly heard from Carl that the top student council president, Reese, was missing. Carl just turned around to say something important to Flo, but the guy was gone and no one even noticed the loss. Flo was no longer just dragging himself along, but was following the kidnapper. But once he was on the street, he told Celia that such jokes were too much. The girl let go of her cousin's hand and asked him to go somewhere with her. And Leo, of course, asked where exactly. Celia explained that they needed to go to the city because the student council president wanted to meet him in person. But the guy didn't understand why, to which the cousin sighed heavily, telling him that he was so narrow-minded, but assured him that he would understand everything himself when they met. When the guys were there and waiting, Celia didn't understand why the one who invited them wanted to meet here, to which Leo said that it actually smelled pretty good here. You could tell from the girl when that mysterious student council president appeared, because she broke into a smile. Shouting out to her older brother, Celia threw herself into his arms, happy that he was okay after such a long absence. Reese immediately greeted Leo, saying that he was very pleased to meet him, after which he clarified that he had already heard about him and at least knew that he was that very academic generalist. In addition to meeting and talking, Reese invited the guys to try the establishment's rather tasty cuisine, which confirmed Leo's words about the pleasant smell. Reese asked everyone if they liked the treat he had chosen, to which Flo immediately replied that they did, but Celia abstained. The girl did not dare to eat the food, and when her brother asked what was wrong, she explained that she would be trying this dish for the first time, so she was a little confused. Having cut off a small piece, Celia nevertheless decided to take the risk in order to at least learn something new for herself. The girl's delight knew no bounds, so she immediately said that it was incredibly delicious, and her brother laughed and said that he had always wanted to take her to this restaurant. Reese asked if he understood correctly that Leo was his aunt's son, to which the guy was surprised, answering with a question that his cousin knew his mother. Reese explained that he had seen Aunt Raina a couple of times when he was still very little, and mentioned in addition that she was quite a famous person at the academy. Flo had a day of discoveries, and now he was surprised by the fact that his mother was talking to him again. To which Reese said that he had not misheard because behind the back of the student Raina, there were many exploits. As one example, Reese mentioned that Raina openly stated that the desserts in the dorm cafeteria were disgusting. And if the incident with the dessert seems like a trifle, then Reese also told about how the aunt gathered the students and burst into the director's office in protest, which even Celia was stunned by, asking if Raina was really behind that famous event. The brother and sister ate deliciously and chatted, discussing the latest news, and both looked incredibly happy. Leo, in turn, took note of the fact that it was not without reason that Riza was called the strongest in Lumen, considering at least what he knew. Looking at the young man, the thought flashed through Flo's mind that Reese's emergence as a hero was only a matter of time. The older brother got up from the table and asked the boys if they wanted to try some desserts, to which Celia clapped her hands and happily agreed. Reese said that he would go pay for their order, and the guys could go ahead for now, and he would catch up with them when he was free. Leo was already at the exit when Reese put his hand under his jacket and his face changed because something didn't go as he had planned. The young man looked at the frame in which the very same sheet of the heroic protocol was located, and something strange was happening to it. Reese couldn't understand why the artifact was emitting such a strong glow if everything had been fine before. Classes continued at the academy, and one of the students told Professor Herod that he had a question for him. It would be surprising if the board didn't say self-study, and Herod was forced to notice Elaine Layden giving the go-ahead for another stupid question. The girl eagerly suggested that they choose a class leader right now by voting. Elena put forward as an argument that the other classes had already chosen their class leaders, with which Tide agreed. Scratching his ear, Edmund very lazily agreed with this, admitting that it had completely slipped his mind. In order to make his task easier, as always, the professor immediately said that Leo should become the head man, to which the guy, as usual, did not react in any way. Elaine didn't understand why the manager decided everything so quickly, and Tide boringly chimed in that the election was conducted by voting. Herod answered briefly, not even with words, but by throwing a huge stack of papers on the table, which took up several hours of work. And when the professor told the head of the class to sort all these papers, Elaine was shocked by the amount of work. The girl sat back down at her desk and was as quiet as a mouse, because even if she had previously been aiming to be a class monitor, after this type of task, she suddenly changed her mind. The loudspeaker announced today's classes in the heroic world. The first-year students were asked to prepare and go to the required classroom for the lesson. Leo asked the professor if they could go, to which he snapped his fingers and replied that, in fact, it was as expected from the headman. The students gathered in the corridor, and everyone who knew each other grouped together and discussed among themselves both the upcoming lesson and the latest news. Leo and Carl were already there, but the alchemist was attracted by something more than the commotion in the corridor. Carl again noticed how tired Chloe looked, although before that he said hello to her just in case, so as not to get what happened last time. The girl did not explain anything, but simply asked if the alchemist had a potion to relieve fatigue and said that she would buy everything. Carl was shocked by this statement, but gave the girl 2 bottles immediately after the request. Having rummaged through his backpack, Carl honestly admitted that this was all he had with him, and Leo asked if Chloe was overexerting herself, since it was only the beginning of the school year. The girl really matched her mana, so she drank the whole bottle of potion without saying anything. Turning away from the guys, Chloe only briefly said that everything was fine with her and went to class. Carl's briefcase disappeared, and he stood there dumbfounded as to why Chloe was killing herself like that, since she already had the highest score in magical theory, to which Chelsea explained that the girl had reason to worry. Chelsea explained that if Leo only picked up on modern trends in magic, he would outdo Chloe in this. Carl, due to his simplicity, still did not understand what was wrong with the second place, to which Chelsea asked if he was stupid or pretending because he looked like a blockhead, and mentioned that Chloe was a canonical sorceress. Chelsea decided to start with an example of herself and explained that she is a combat mage, so a 2 in theory will not upset her. But for a future employee of the Magic Tower, gaps in knowledge are unacceptable, since this is a matter of honor. The girl told Carl that she did not understand how he could be called a magician, to which he confidently replied that usually he was just a practitioner. Carl also didn't forget to mention that although, according to Chelsea, he is a blockhead, He's already successfully making a living with his practicality. From behind the crowd came cries of "die" and loud slaps, but Chloe heard them but was too tired to pay attention. Meanwhile, the director was calmly wiping the plants in his office. The calm did not last long, however, and Mr. Kalyan felt some changes regarding the academy. The director felt that the damaged protocol page was reacting to something near it. Mr. Kalyan looked at the fragment of the page while sitting at his desk in the office and asked the student council president if it was true that the hero protocol page had reacted. Reese confirmed that he clearly observed the glow, although there were no relics nearby, and the page was so damaged that it should not have given a reaction at all. The director sternly asked if the page had had any reaction after the recent events, to which the guy honestly replied that he had never seen anything. Mr. Kalyan thoughtfully looked at a piece of the page close by, muttering to himself under his breath that it was necessary to sort out this issue. But even in such a serious and incomprehensible situation, the director did not forget about the guy, so he was understanding about the fact that he had only recently returned and was most likely tired, so she praised Riza for his excellent work and asked him to go and rest. Mr. Kalyan closed the box with an important albeit small detail and called Elena, after which the assistant appeared. The girl was ready for the director's instructions, which he in turn trusted her as he trusted himself. Mr. Kalyan asked Elena to take the box to the other exhibits in the Hall of Origins, since joint classes for first years would soon begin. When the assistant left, the director turned to the huge windows, thinking about what sometimes happens so that even such small fragments of the protocol begin to react. And the reason for the fragment's reaction is the appearance nearby of the hero indicated in the protocol. To begin their joint classes, the first years chose a large auditorium at Lumen Academy so that everyone could fit. On stage stood the pretty homeroom teacher of Class 1, 8, Ariana Neer, who was trying her best to control the noise in the room and asking for silence. But the students did nothing but chatter incessantly, not paying attention to the man who, at the very least, was an authority figure for them. Ariana wasn't going to stand on ceremony with the little bastards, and repeated one last time about keeping the audience quiet, only this time in a slightly different way. Already at the stage of aura activation, the guys fell silent and stared at that very pretty teacher who was now more than clear. But it was too late, and the dragon burst out screaming that if the little bastards value their skins, they should slam their bread slicers right now or death will overtake them instantly. To make it as clear as possible how to behave, Ariana asked the first guy she came across in the front row whether she should start with him, but he shook his head frantically. The anger was almost out, but Ariana wanted to shout out her last complaint about how these idiots always disobey. The voice stopped sounding like it was from hell and became sweet again when the professor heard the silence that was so beautiful to her ears. The dragon disappeared, and in its place the angel reappeared, who breathed a sigh of relief that he could finally speak calmly. Ariana waved her little hands sweetly, thanking all the students for being such good boys. One student thought that he had seen Ariana so angry many times already, but every time he was ready to shit his pants like the first time. And Leo, as always, sat calmly watching the professor no matter what state she was in, and thanks to his observation skills, he realized that Ariana was a spiritualist, and even in his past life it was hard to find someone like that. Although the dragon had disappeared, a razor-sharp blade appeared in Ariana's hand, and this did not make things any easier. But the professor only said that they would continue their classes in the heroic class for first years. Having shown everyone the knife, the leader said that after the appearance of the heroic protocol in their lives, reasons for creating clans of heroes also appeared. Running her finger along the blade, causing the blades to ring, Ariana also explained that in order to open the hero's world, an object is needed that has a deep connection with him. So that students would know for the future, Ariana also told them that the world is most easily revealed to the descendants of such heroes. From the fact about the descendants, the following emerges that the Lumen Academy, where the hero protocol is stored, maintains a connection with the families of heroes, reminiscent of the relationship between a chest and a key. Leo listened to the professor and was ready to listen even more, while Carl was already drooling from a sweet dream nearby. Elena entered the auditorium just as Ariana asked everyone if they now understood the importance of classes in the world of heroes, to which everyone answered yes in unison. Ariana finally clarified once again that heroic classes are important because they help to learn more about heroes and their worlds. So in senior years, the guys have to choose the hero whose power they want to inherit and clear the page from his world. Elena politely waited for the professor to finish his speech, and then approached her with that very important part of the lesson. Elena handed Ariana the box and she reached for it, asking the guys for another minute of attention to explain what she had in her hands. An image of the box was displayed on the screen so that it could be seen better, and the professor explained that it was a fragment of the heroic protocol that the fifth-year students had obtained during a recent mission to clear the dungeon. Ariana began to open the small wooden box, causing the students' excitement to skyrocket. At the last moment, the leader slammed the box shut without showing the fragment, but instead said that now something needed to be done before testing it, which made the students' hearts sink because they were bursting with curiosity. Ariana asked the audience if the students would like to share with everyone what kind of hero they would like to become. Celia was the first to volunteer, saying that she wanted to become a knight who would surpass all previous generations of her family, and the professor praised such a great goal. Chloe also shared that she would like to write a book containing her own personal spells. A guy from the first row stood up, who almost got it from the dragon, but as soon as he started talking, Carl interrupted him and said that he would like to support the heroes in their battles in every possible way. Ariana thought it was great that student Carl wanted to become a pillar of support for the heroic world, and at that moment Leo stood up. The guy quite seriously stated that his goal was to completely get rid of Erebos, and of course only those who knew what he was talking about understood him. Ariana was shocked by such a statement, and Carl was clearly ashamed of his strange friend, but it was indicative that Seijin and Harad were also stunned. In order not to sow some kind of incomprehensible atmosphere, the manager, a little nervously but quickly changed the subject, saying that this was a wonderful goal and asked the next person to tell about themselves. There were also some bullies who, once again, were only capable of yapping behind their backs about how Leo had some big dreams, to which the other replied that he was the head man, who was on a different level. But Seijin asked Harad what he thought about Leo's statement, and without joking, said that he actually had goosebumps because the professor knew that the guy was not one to throw words to the wind. Moreover, Harad remembered very well that hundreds of years had already passed since Erebos was broken into several parts that were sealed, and at the same time there were cases of its resurrection, and even a small fragment could cause a catastrophe. And knowing such information, Edmund now heard from Leo that he intended to completely get rid of Erebos, and this was another indicator that the student was not simple. Aura finally opened the box for everyone to see in order to satisfy the students' curiosity, and suggested that they start reading the fragment, after which each class should guess who these notes are about and move on to the training cleanup. The headmistress separately clarified that in case of emergency, professors would observe the lesson, so she asked the students not to act up. The students couldn't believe that they were finally going to touch something truly real and heroic. Nella was excited to be touching the hero protocol for the first time, and Tide agreed that he was also very nervous. Ariana first asked the class leaders from each class to come forward before the others. Without a doubt, Leo came out ahead, as did Celia, which again spoke of either their cooperation or rivalry. But the cream of society did not stay on the sidelines either, since Abbott came forward, which was also quite expected, and Chen also pulled herself up. When the class leaders approached Ariana, she reported that this time the students had obtained 2 fragments at once, but only one would be used in the lesson. The professor actually held out 2 boxes for demonstration, explaining that the second piece was too small, but now the students would be shown 2 at once, so that in the future they would know that something like this could happen. Leo was once again a pioneer, reaching out his hand to a smaller piece of the protocol. As soon as the young man touched the paper, the world that was sealed in it began to appear instantly. Flo looked at the glow without any fear or doubt, continuing to confidently hold the fragment. The heroic protocol was declared open, and besides the light, the wind ruffled Leo and Ariana's hair as if they were already in that world. But if during the exam the world that RV opened was written down, and it was clear where everyone was, then the world and chapter that Leo opened were classified. Seijin could not believe that the world was really pouring out, but it was too late to change anything. The students and professors along with them found themselves in a rather dark world at that time. The first thing the students saw were the corpses of monsters that someone had already dealt with and were simply rotting on the ground. One of the students couldn't hold back and shouted, "Is she really seeing real corpses in front of her now?" For the first time, Harad showed not laziness but protection towards the students, asking them to be on guard since they were now in a heroic dungeon. Seijin also thought faster than the confused students and told his colleague that the walls of the fortress were visible on the other side. Leo looked at the last line of defense and the last bastion of hope in an era of disaster that was the walls of Guardslan. The guy addressed himself as Kyle, with the fact that if this is the right time, then his wish was so stupid that he heard a ghostly voice that confirmed that the wish was indeed truly idiotic. Not only Leo saw her, but everyone else turned around at the voice of the one about whom legends are still not forgotten. The great heroine approached everyone and said that despite everything that had happened or would happen, they would still save the world. For the first time, Flo looked at his old friend with such longing, while realizing that they would have to part again. Leo quietly said the name of the warrior Lucinus, who began to dissolve into the air like ash, just like everything else that surrounded them. But the wise ruler, even when she disappeared, still left her smile in Leo's memory so that he would remember her like that. The hero's world began to shatter like glass, and the students gradually found themselves back in the classroom, still in a state of shock. Chen immediately asked the professors to explain to them what had just happened and why they were in such a dangerous place. To which Herod sternly informed everyone that classes were canceled and asked the students to remain calm and leave the large hall. The students left the hall, quietly buzzing like a beehive among themselves about what had happened. Leo also followed everyone, but his attention was on a small piece of paper that still seemed to reflect Lucinus's smile. The guy realized that he had his protocol in his hands, or rather Kyle's protocol, which is considered a fake. Herod looked closely at the young man, becoming increasingly convinced that he was not just a talented student. The silence in the classroom was cut by a piercing and drawn-out question, "What?" which was not uttered by a guy. Elena couldn't believe her own ears when she learned from Leo that he saw the Queen of Wisdom herself. And Chelsea was also shocked because such a meeting is worth a lot, and Carl just opened his mouth supporting the girl's shock. Elena was so impressed that she even started to get angry that she was not a head girl, which is why the alchemist laughed, telling the girl that she had no business being a head girl. It was in vain that the jester blurted out such a thing to the one with the fire mana, because right after Carl blurted it out, Elaine asked whether he would bury himself or should she help him. A melancholy Mr. Herod appeared at the door, informing the students that he had come to punish those who were making the most noise, and the assholes turned out to be from his class. Before leaving, the leader simply gave the guys a choice, from which there was either self-preparation or expulsion. On such a gloomy note, the professor slammed the door and dead silence reigned in the office. Flo sat thinking about why his hero protocol was so strange, because even the name of the world and chapter was not displayed. And in his memory, Lucinus's words about how they would save the world were beating around the corner. And at the same time, Leo had a strong feeling that someone had deliberately destroyed his heroic protocol. The young man also remembered that the heroic protocol is, in fact, an object in which a particle of the hero's power remains. But if there is someone who does not want the hero to have followers, then everything connected with him will be destroyed. The first thing that came to Leo's mind was Erebos, after which he decided at all costs to find out why his protocol was split. A month passed after the incident with the hero's world and classes were held in the magic department. Professor Glenn explained to the students the task of their transfer exam, which would be based on either original or unique magic. As always, most of the students, without even listening to the end, began an indignant discussion about the fact that there were some exams again. Mr. Glenn would not leave the first years without an explanation that original magic reflects the personality of the magician. But in the era of activation formulas, magicians do not strive for originality. At the same time, the professor clarified that original magic is an ace up the sleeve if it comes to a fight. As an example, Mr. Glenn explained that the star magic that the elves had was only a tiny fragment of the original magic. In this case, the professor mentioned the only one who could use star magic, and it was the stargazer Luna. Chloe immediately turned to Leo, who was just sitting and listening to the lecture, as if he had nothing to do with such magic. The girl still remembered how Flo used star magic against her during the match, but she didn't tell anyone about it because they would have considered her crazy. Leo also paid attention, but not to Chloe, but to the book she was reading. The young man immediately caught the aura emanating from the object, which was quite suspicious. Chloe noticed her deskmate's intense gaze, and she didn't like the close attention she received. The girl pushed the book behind her so as not to attract unnecessary attention and questions. It was already too late to hide anything, because Flo noticed the Book of Magic, and at that moment Mr. Glenn said that he was looking forward to the students' personal developments and that classes were over for today. Chloe tried to blend into the crowd as unnoticed as possible and leave the classroom as if she knew Leo would latch on. But even secrecy and silence did not help the girl because the guy grabbed her hand and asked her to wait a minute. Ice Girl didn't like such a sharp gesture towards her, especially from a rival with whom she always has to compete. For the first time, Leo smiled insincerely and also hypocritically asked if his classmate would like to have lunch together. But the guy's attention was not on the girl, but on the bag in which the book was, and Flo thought that Chloe had deliberately hidden it. Chloe snatched her hand back and snapped that she didn't have time for this if she was going to beat the guy in the upcoming exam. Just as Flo wanted to say something to the girl, Carl appeared, and as always attacked his friend at the wrong time, called him a scoundrel, and asked how he dared to aim for the place of the Ice Queen. To Chloe's surprise, she admitted that she had already lost to Leo, but when it came to formulas, she had to be the best. The girl was so nervous that her hands involuntarily clenched into fists, and the guys prepared themselves for what they were about to get in the neck with. Only Chloe, instead of fighting, simply said that this time she would win without any doubt. Leo understood everything perfectly and only asked that any botched work on his part would only be rudeness towards the girl, to which she nodded in response. The young man agreed with what Chloe explained to him, and holding out his hand suggested that he prepare well for the upcoming exam. Unlike the previous handshake, when Chloe was in tears and angry after the match, now she confidently went to an agreement with her opponent. Carl was shocked by how natural the handshake looked, as if he had never seen anything more beautiful before. Finally, Leo was able to get into the Tower of Heroes, and ahead of him, in addition to the long journey, there was still a difficult task waiting. The guy walked up the steps, keeping in mind that somewhere here, there should be the forbidden archives of the Lumen Academy, and if he finds them, he will also find a clue about his missing protocol. Leo realized that his path would indeed be difficult, but not because of the number of steps, but because he would meet other students along the way, just like this time, where the girls couldn't contain their emotion when they saw the first-year student. It was as if Leo was going through levels where each time he had to overcome an obstacle. This time, the guy was on his way to the same fifth-year student he saw from the window when the guys returned from the cleanup. Toria Yang from the Magic Division told Flo that she had heard about him from Professor Glenn, and now she was glad to finally meet him in person. Leo decided to be on the safe side and greet the older student as respectfully as possible, so he bowed. But the girl still decided not to let the young man pass, putting her foot in his path, wondering what could have brought the little one to the Tower of Heroes. Flo didn't hide it and said as it is that he was going to personally talk to the student council president. Toria set a condition in the form of the guy choosing a magical unit, and then she would let him go further. Leo answered the high school student without hesitation that he already regularly attended magic classes, which pleased her. The girl stepped aside, no longer putting up any obstacles, for which Flo thanked her and continued on his way. But having risen a little, Toria called Leo again, confessing that she would like to be as frank with him as possible, so she would say something directly. The girl expressed her hopes that the young man would finally transfer to the Magic Division before the end of the semester. Flo turned to Toria and silently nodded in agreement, and a little in order to continue his climb. From afar, the guy saw that he could get further using the elevator and not on foot, which could not but please him. Leo entered the elevator and pressed the floor he needed, expecting the doors to close and him to go up. But even after several presses, nothing happened. And then Flo felt awkward. When Leo asked why it wasn't working, someone behind him answered, explaining and showing that mana had to be invested to activate the elevator. When little Flo turned to his savior, he even had to raise his head and hear from above that the guy was very happy to see them. Lee Jamia from the Night Division asked the kid if he was the same first-year all-rounder, who was also the class president. Flo bowed in greeting to the elder, who asked what brought the young man to the Tower of Heroes. Leo boldly stated as it was that he was heading to the student council president for a personal conversation. Lee liked the fact that the kid wasn't even nervous in front of him, and he called coming to the student council's abode alone bravery. Leo wanted to say something about how he wasn't going to barge in when suddenly Jemiah asked, in light of the guy's bravery, that the nightly unit was just for him. Flo decided to just smile sweetly and laugh, because he understood that if he refused, he would have no end of problems. But he still needed to see Reese. Finally reaching the student council office, the guy admitted that he was already at the limit, although he had not yet completed the main task. But exhaling, he knocked on the door and asked President Rosinas if he could come in. Reese asked to come in, but did not expect to see Leo behind the door, who finally saw the person he needed. Celia's brother, shuffling through papers, smiled and asked his friend what he was doing there, although he was still glad to see him. Leo quite seriously told Reese that he needed access to the Forbidden Archive, knowing perfectly well what he was asking for. Reese looked at the guy and expressed his understanding that he knew perfectly well that Leo was not the type to joke like that. But the senior explained that for an ordinary student, there are only two ways to get into the archive, where the first is to clear the heroic dungeon in order to return the protocol page. Leo asked about the second method himself, showing that he was not going to back down and would like to know all the conditions. To announce the second method, Reese smiled slyly and said that it consists of joining the student council, after which it will be possible to get to know him. When the day of the selection exams for the nightly division arrived, the students gathered on the field. Carl decided not to miss this opportunity and told everyone who would be watching the show to take popcorn, which would make watching it much more interesting. Chelsea felt sick again about what a traitor Carl was, to which Elena laughed and told her friend that he already was like that. And by the way, even without the Lumen Academy, he could make it in life. Leo turned his head in different directions looking for Chloe, while the crowd cheered that the tournament was about to begin. Professor Ein loudly announced that he was announcing the first fight that would open the exam. The first participants to be announced were Howl Snape from Class 1 and Leo Flo from Class 5, who were asked to come out and stand opposite each other. Carl noticed Professor Sagen and realized that such a goldmine could not be missed. The young man ran up to greet the professor like a bullet, to which the professor, although he also greeted him, immediately asked what the young man wanted from him. Since Mr. Sagen himself was interested in why Carl had come over, he offered a drink and popcorn. Sagen smiled, telling Carl not to even hope that he would buy it, and asked him to go and better offer something similar to Harid. Suddenly Carl noticed that Celia was moving in his direction with a rather menacing look, which indicated possible problems for the guy. But as it turned out, Celia approached Professor Sagen and, making cat eyes, asked him to buy some treats for his students. Carl encouraged the students to shout the professor's name, and they supported the alchemist in order to appease the leader. Sighing heavily, Sagen closed his eyes and asked to hand out popcorn to each person one at a time, which the guy was incredibly happy about. The participants prepared for the fight, standing opposite each other and waiting for the signal. Leo was glad that he went to hand over first because that way he would shoot and be free. Howl, in turn, did not appreciate that his opponent was underestimating him, something he would now regret. Not only did Carl conduct his sales perfectly, but he also oratorically explained the rules of the qualifying tests, which consisted of winning 5 duels. The guys started discussing the level of combat skills of their leader, to which it was said that given that Leo is a generalist, there is a difference in the narrowness of skills between him and the representatives of the same unit. But at the same time, it was worth remembering that on the enemy side there was Howl, who was considered the third strongest in Class 1 after Celia and Duran. Howl was very good with his spear, but was weak in understanding the combat because now he was more controlled by negative thoughts about Flo, who for him was an arrogant idiot who also hung around Celia. Ein announced that the victory would be awarded to the one who would disable the opponent and asked to treat the duel as a real battle. But Leo at some point had no time for battle because he felt a cluster of ominous energy coming from behind him. The guy turned towards the academy to make sure he had felt correctly. The energy really did come from the academy, and there was a huge accumulation of it, but the source was not clear. Meanwhile, Chloe, whom Leo was looking for, was sitting at the table trying to write her own spell in preparation for the exam. The girl had already torn several pages of the notebook and squeezed it, but her anger was gaining momentum. Not only was Chloe tired, but now she also couldn't do anything or somehow move from the dead point. The girl was shaking because with her current skill level, she would not be able to create unique magic, and out of anger, she hit a stack of books. Such a strong sorceress was driven by the desire to win over Leo, so she was not going to give in to him again, especially not during the exam. Chloe looked at the floor where the books she had thrown down lay, and one of them seemed to beckon her towards it. The aura of the book haunted the student and only fueled her desire to win. For a moment, Chloe hesitated to approach the book because she wasn't sure if it would be enough, but her ardent desire to win took over. Leo stood and watched the dark tongues of negative aura writhe, completely forgetting about the competition. Howl decided not to waste time or opportunity, and telling Leo that he was too careless, attacked him with a spear. But the guy, remaining in place, simply moved his head to the side, watching the movement of the weapon. Having regained his distance, Leo watched as Howl ran towards him again, realizing that the guy's weapon was a snake spear. Howl rushed towards his opponent to hit him right in the chest, and there was very little time left before the collision. And Leo simply stopped the spear in front of his nose with his bare hand without even moving from the spot, which was an amazing sight. While Howl could not understand where such a frail young man got such strength, he pulled the spear towards himself along with the owner of the weapon. The guy saw the light when he felt Flo push him forward along with the spear and didn't have time to do anything, so he immediately got punched in the face when Leo pulled the weapon towards himself. Hal flew back like a rocket as if a ball had been kicked and ended up far away from his opponent. Only after he got his brain straightened out did Leo ask Hal if he was really careless or maybe the opposite. Having activated the poisonous fog, Hal asked Flo not to pretend to be all-powerful because the game had just begun. The young man thought that Leo didn't know how to control the aura and that such an effect as poisonous fog couldn't be overcome with just his fists. Flo also activated fire mana, sarcastically throwing to the guy that the poisonous aura is a rather interesting thing. Thanks to his protective shell of fire, Leo kept the poisonous fog away from him and burned it away as he headed towards Howl. The young man remained self-confident, clarifying to Leo that only Celia's flame could block such an attack of his for now. And Flo, having made his way to the guy through the thick poisonous fog, appeared with the words that Howl still hadn't caught up with something. So the owner of the fiery aura was once again close enough to the poisonous bug to continue the duel, and the fog had almost completely cleared. At this epic moment, the students realized that it was worth taking popcorn from Carl because the battle had just begun, and it was already incredibly interesting to watch. Duran watched the duel from the stands, preparing himself for the fact that he would have to go through a clash with Leo again. Chelsea clapped her hands in joy for Leo, but Celia looked at her cousin in horror, not understanding when he managed to increase the power of his fiery aura. Hal couldn't understand how a brat like Flo could have flame power on par with even Celia. Leo approached the guy, but he still didn't want to believe that this idiot universalist was capable of such power. Howl didn't want to lose face, so he angrily warned Leo that now he would have to use what he had prepared for Celia. The young man shouted to his opponent that he didn't think it would be necessary to use such a powerful weapon against such an unworthy competitor. But since he was crazy, he used the snake shackles. For Flo, the snake didn't look that dangerous considering he had once killed Erebos himself, but he admitted that it was pretty good for Howl. The poisonous guy turned to Celia thinking that he would now see delight or shock on her face since he had originally prepared such an attack for her. As it turned out, the girl sat in absolute indifference to Howl's showiness and simply watched the fight. The most interesting thing happened when Celia decided to show sympathy and pointed her finger at Howl in the direction where Leo was standing. The guy turned around and saw that the snake shackles he had placed on his opponent were covered in bubbles and were about to burst from the temperature. The snake flew in different directions like a torn rag, and Leo didn't even have to make any special efforts to remove it from himself. Poor Howl showed fear mixed with anger on his face for the first time because he thought that such a spell was impossible to overcome. Acting more out of fear of hopelessness, Howl swung his spear at Flo to end this nightmare faster. But Leo also did not stand still, and noticing the movements of his opponent, he prepared to repel the attack, so he took up his sword. With one clear blow, Flo knocked the weapon out of Howl's hands and the spear flew back, and then it was a small matter. Pointing his sword at his opponent, Leo advised him not to get distracted while his flame continued to burn, and after that, the judge declared Flo the winner. The audience shouted the winner's name, and along with them, Chelsea, who shouted louder than anyone else that nothing else was expected from Leo, and Carl was also glad that he could count on his friend. Hal left the field thinking that it was impossible to be so skilled even in practice, which is why it is not surprising that Flo is not inferior to Celia. The boy flinched when he heard Celia ask him if he was impressed with Leo's skills. But despite the defeat, Princess Zerdinger enthusiastically reported that the game was still stunning. When Hal heard such a statement from the girl, he laughed embarrassedly, looking away. The next one asked to come out for the duel was Elaine Layden from the 5th grade, who was already warming up her fists. But when the girl heard that Chen Xia was asked to leave Class 10 against her, she was shocked that she was put with her. Chen, as always, went to meet her opponent with a smile, while Elaine suffered from the fact that a top student was assigned to her. If ordinary people were to look at the girls from the outside, the princesses would look very cute to them, but in fact, something grandiose was planned. Chen greeted her rival with respect and asked her to be gentle with her without any malice or sarcasm. Elena repeated the gesture towards her opponent and also asked him not to hit her too hard. After the referee gave the signal to start the duel, Chen immediately activated her water mana, but her movements were smooth. The way the students moved was like a beautiful dance of struggle between two opposing elements, which could not help but bewitch. The only difference between the girls was that their character matched the powers they possessed, and Elaine rushed forward hotly, attacking the water. Leo couldn't have missed this, but he came to the conclusion almost immediately that someone was going to be in a lot of pain, and it was clearly not Chen. What was said was that the guy had his eye on the water, because the next moment Elaine seemed to cut the flow of water. but it had already overwhelmed her, and she couldn't move. Elaine flew quite a distance from Chen from the impact and landed not so softly. The poor thing lay on the ground, coughing up both the water and the dust that had risen after her fall. The judge declared Chen Xia the winner, who in the same calm manner bowed with respect to everyone involved in the fight, including Elaine. The girl did not cry or whine that she failed to win. On the contrary, she was proud of herself for not being afraid to go up against such an opponent. Leo noted to Elena that her duel was not initially the fairest in terms of choosing an opponent, but at the same time, if the girl had concentrated, she would have done much better. The students buzzed like bees when they heard Celia from Class 1 announced, realizing that this was going to be quite a show. And Celia also went out on the drive trying to guess what kind of cool opponent they would give him in order to give it his all. The girl did not expect at all to hear an announcement about Duran Noir, who was from her class. But Celia realized that this was exactly what was needed, so she told the guy directly that this would be a truly fun duel. Moira, as always, was not very talkative and was already more focused on the fight, so he did not say anything to his classmate in response. For such an occasion, even Carl took the biggest bucket of popcorn for himself and was ready to watch the coolest show of his life. Leo also told his friend that this duel promised to be quite exciting, to which Card handed him a bucket and shouted to the guys on the field to finally start. The students looked at the tongues of flame and the sparkling lightning, and all this in the front row, which excited the blood. Before starting the fight, Celia decided to tease the boring Duran a little and said that now they would see who was the best knight in Class 1. The guy only drew his eyebrows together even more, making himself look like a terribly formidable fighter. No matter what blow Duran dealt with his sword, Celia parried each one perfectly, and it was no longer entirely clear where the sparks were coming from. Carl even stopped eating popcorn and sometimes forgot how to breathe from such a sight. But he definitely did not forget to ask Leo who he was betting on. Flo thought for a second and replied that he was more than sure that Celia would win, to which Carl concluded that the guy was heartless, and none of them noticed Professor Herod behind them. Even from the stands, Leo noticed the look in Celia's eyes, which made him realize that she definitely had an ace up her sleeve. The guy immediately realized that the girl had a plan that would help her turn the situation to her advantage. Duran picked up speed to attack Celia, using it to boost his power. The blow landed right next to the girl's face, but she was able to dodge in time and did not lose her vigilance, although she would have panicked and given up earlier. The battle became more and more heated, and the blades of the swords again rang loudly after each repelled attack. Celia chose the right moment and, raising her weapon up, endowed it with her mana, and a ball appeared, indicating that it would now be even hotter. All the flames that Princess Zerdinger released rested against the invisible dome and grew larger and larger. Leo said that Celia was a good girl because she was able to figure it out in time, but Card still didn't understand anything. Flo explained to his friend that given that the training ground for freshmen is not particularly large, Celia realized that she did not have to run after Duran, so she used the size of the hall to her advantage. It was already possible to observe how Duran was limited inside the barrier engulfed in flames, and in addition, the heat limited his vision. Leo boldly stated that Celia was pretty good, but now she has become even cooler and gives her all. While Duran stood there feeling that it had become quite hot, the girl was already behind him, attacking. Moira managed to turn around to repel the attack, still knowing her classmate a little, but the advantage was on her side. The guy was not just fighting to pass the exam, but once again, he wanted to prove something to someone that was unnecessary. So he went on the attack from a destructive perspective. Celia, like a fiery fury, without taking her eyes off her opponent, grabbed his sword with her bare hand. The girl, quite joyfully, as if for a fight, shouted to Moira that here he was, caught, and swung her head in his direction. Celia decided to end the duel beautifully, so she hit Duran in the forehead with her head, which he did not expect at all. The young man passed out from the blow while still in flight to the ground with a huge hematoma on his forehead. When Duran's body hit the ground, the judge declared Celia Zerdinger the winner. Who would have thought? But the girl told Moira that he should work on his physical strength, which in turn Leo once told her. Rubbing his forehead, the guy again made a menacing grimace, but even despite this, Celia still gave him her hand. The young man stood up with the help of his partner and bowed to her in gratitude. No doubt, at the moment of the handshake, the students started shouting what a cute couple they were and immediately wanted to capture it on camera. Leo proudly declared that Celia's training had paid off, and Card screamed at the top of his lungs how amazing she was. Here, Herod entered the conversation and, after shocking the guys with his presence, he took a handful of popcorn and said that Celia had indeed won. As he left, Mr. Edmund thanked the headman for his comments about the fight, after which Carl nervously asked how long he had been eavesdropping on everything. The night division finished with a score of 4 wins and 1 loss for Celia and Duran, as well as Chen. And without any doubt, Leo Flo was able to take all 5 victories without a single defeat.